Star Trek has, from time to time, produced episodes that are heartwarming and uplifting. There have been episodes that show the lighter side of the future, from friendships to love stories to even the bond between person and ship. This is not that list. Gene Roddenberry knew exactly what he was doing when he set out to create a show to tell morality plays on a weekly basis, reflecting the wrongs he saw in society back on the audience that was watching. For many, many years, Star Trek has never been afraid to tackle some of the deeper and darker aspects of the world around it. With that in mind, I'm Sean Ferrick from TrekCulture, and these are 10 Star Trek episodes that pissed people off. 10. Plato's Stepchildren. The infamous kiss between Uhura and Kirk in Star Trek has long been a tentpole in the history of not only Star Trek, but in history in general. While the status of the episode containing the first interracial kiss on television has since been debated, even in Star Trek itself, with Kirk kissing Lieutenant Marlena Moreau in the second season episode Mirror Mirror, Moreau was played by Filipino actress Barbara Luna, the furore that preceded the filming of the kiss was in anticipation of the fallout from the conservative television stations, as the fear was that they would refuse to screen the kiss, and they were, in a way, correct. The kiss has gone down in infamy, however, as Nichols reflected later. The taboo of the piece was greater than the fallout. While there was hate mail, it was nothing like the deluge that they've been expecting. Star Trek showed with that one moment of television that some taboos were ready to be challenged. 9. The High Ground. The Star Trek The Next Generation episode The High Ground is frequently cited episode as one of the show's most controversial. The depiction of a terrorist group in a sympathetic light, something that DS9 would not shy away from with Major Kira, was somewhat shocking. However, the connection to a real-world events caused the real stir. The episode aired in early 1990, but was not screened on either BBC or RTE, the two national broadcasters. This is due to the reference of Irish reunification, which in 1990 was an idea so alien that the conception of the Good Friday peace agreement was still a decade away. To date, it has not been aired on RTE, as the memories of the Troubles are still fresh in the Irish psyche. Even the writers and producers on the show were not happy with the episode, with Ronald D. Moore, Michael Pillar and Brannon Braga all lamenting that it fell far short of the message they had hoped to put out, to paint a nuanced picture of terror groups and their methods. 8. Shades of Grey. This episode angered people for the pure pointlessness of it. The episode was a casualty of the writer's strike in 1988, resulting in Star Trek The Next Generation's second season running short on episodes. The idea to create a clip show was conceived, which would work around a flimsy plot. While other series have managed to successfully include clip shows in their runs, Stargate SG-1 would be a good example of this, Shades of Grey absolutely missed the mark. Reviews of the episode range from "they did the best they could with the strike" to "there's no excuse for how terrible it is." An unfortunate side effect of this episode was that Diana Muldaur's final appearance in Star Trek was in one of its worst ever entries. As Morris Hurley, outgoing producer, said of this episode, "Piece of shit, terrible, just terrible." 7. Second Contact. Star Trek Lower Decks has now hit the airwaves, with their season opener Second Contact being the franchise's first half-hour season premiere since Beyond the Furthest Star, and it hit the ground running. It has proved to be like Marmite. Some people love it, and some people hate it. Some of the loudest complaints state that the crew on board the USS Cerritos are simply not Starfleet, and by virtue of the show being a Star Trek show, this fact is unforgivable. Reasons cited included mariners drinking on the job, and the slicing of Boimler's leg, the amount of censored swearing, and the date that Rutherford shares with Barnes, despite the zombie outbreak around them. It is certainly not everyone's cup of tea, but it announced what it was from the beginning and tonally has remained on point ever since. 6. Rejoined. According to Ronald D. Moore, this episode received fierce backlash from conservative homes that felt angry that they haven't been given a warning that it would feature a homosexual kiss between two women. The political climate in 1995 still had a ways to go before it would be more inclusive of LGBTQIA+ issues, resulting in this episode receiving heavy criticism, despite the cast and crew's assertions that the episode was not about homosexuality at all. The taboo of the episode is that current hosts of former Trill lovers should not be allowed to rekindle a relationship to avoid creating a hierarchy of the species. Ira Stephen Bear commented that due to the number of complaints that the episode received, he was dismayed to find that there was still a large amount of conservatism in many of the fans of Star Trek at the time, something antithetical to the message behind Roddenberry's Star Trek. 5. Threshold. Look, to be very honest, the angry fans kinda have a point here. Threshold is often considered among the worst episodes of Star Trek for several reasons. The apparent flying in the face of established rules, although this is not technically correct, as Roddenberry had originated the idea of Warp 10 would occupy every point in the universe back in the days of The Next Generation, and the episode's poor resolution make for an unenjoyable viewing experience. Brannon Braga, who wrote the episode, lamented that it is the episode he is most remembered for, despite having written well over 100 episodes of Star Trek. Kate Mulgrew spoke spoke at a 2009 fan convention saying that she was most uncomfortable with this episode, particularly in mating with the lizard Tom Paris. Despite all of this, Robert Duncan McNeill enjoyed the episode, as it allowed him to expand his range as an actor. 4. These Are the Voyages. This episode has the merits of so bad it's good, but at the time of release, it was a serious misstep by the writers. Enterprise had been cancelled, but rather than let it end on its own merits, it was retroactively shoved into an episode of The Next Generation, which made no sense plot-wise and only served to end the show with a whimper. The episode faces the most criticism for where it lies in the franchise. It is the last episode of Enterprise. Showrunner Manny Coto says that he saw the episode as a coda rather than a finale, with Terra Prime and Demons being the actual ending of the show. Jolene Blalock called the episode appalling, while Dominic Keating truly enjoyed it. Marina Sirtis is somewhere in the middle, stating that she felt the episode was a good episode, but just not a good finale. 3. The Outcast. This episode was Star Trek's attempt at taking on conversion therapy and addressing LGBTQIA+ issues. However, despite the best of intentions, the episode fell short of expectations. Rick Berman spoke about the reaction to this episode. He said that they received many letters from members of the LGBTQIA+ community who felt that this episode was a poor attempt of Star Trek washing its hands of the topic, and that the episode was too oblique and didn't go far enough. Earlier in Star Trek's production history, David Gerrold, writer of The Trouble with Tribbles, had penned a script called Blood and Fire, which featured Star Trek's first openly gay character and was an attempt to discuss AIDS in Star Trek, the franchise's first attempt to deal with issues that had faced LGBTQIA+ people. The script, however, was continually rebuked and eventually shelved, although it would finally see the light of day as a produced episode of Star Trek New Voyages. 2. Dear Doctor. Dear Doctor is one of the first great episodes in Enterprise. The Star Trek prequel series had struggled somewhat in its first year, relying on a standard that had worked for the Next Generation of Voyager, in that the episodes were all standalone and often toothless. Dear Doctor was a step away from this, while still remaining standalone. The episode is the first tease of the Prime Directive. The structure of the episode is quite like Data's Day, in which much of the story is told in voiceover from Dr. Phlox's point of view. The ship encounters a world with 2 alien races, one of which is reaching the end of its genetic life. While Phlox discovers a way to change this, Archer decides to withhold this information as it would interrupt the natural flow of evolution on the planet. The episode generated a lot of controversy in the decision to let evolution play its part. The episode was also accused of okaying genocide, simply to avoid breaking the rules. This seems something closer to personal taste, while technically there was no Prime Directive, so up to you. Number 1. Stardust City Rag. This was the episode that generated the most controversy in Star Trek Picard. The opening scene of the episode, 7 of 9 attempts to save Icheb from torture and death. The scene involves one of the most graphic scenes in Star Trek's history, as his eye is torn from its socket. Star Trek has for years shown things like the vaporization of people, the destruction of entire starships and cities, along with knifings, beatings, and, memorably in Chain of Command, brutal physical and psychological torture. So what was wrong with this episode? It came out of nowhere. In the cold open of the episode, Icheb, a legacy character, though portrayed by a different actor, is killed in horrible fashion so that the episode can set up Seven's journey, a journey which culminates in her killing another in cold blood. Whatever side of this debate you come down on, it was a truly shocking opening to an episode, along with a disturbing finish. It is one of the most polarizing episodes of all of Star Trek since Picard began airing, and, like all good Trek, it is generating discussion.
Generation is beloved by Trekkies all over the world, and with good reason. It gave us an incredible cast of characters led by the morally upright Captain Jean-Luc Picard, the iconic Data, and the charming William T. Riker. It contains a bevy of classic episodes showcasing Star Trek principles and humanity at its finest, while expanding on an optimistic future that filled viewers with hope. It's thus easy to forget that throughout its 7-season run there were a ton of clunkers, especially in those rough first 2 years. Now, with an older Jean-Luc Picard having returned to the past in Picard Season 2, let us also travel back to the rough early days of the USS Enterprise to see just how far we've come. These adventures were so bad that casual viewers puzzled over why Star Trek had such a following, while veteran fans wondered if Star Trek should have ended with the original series adventures of Captain James T. Kirk and Spock. And so, with that in mind then, I'm Ellie with TrekCulture, here with the 10 most hated Star Trek The Next Generation episodes. Number 10. Manhunt. While undergoing a betazoid phase that quadruples her sex drive, Lwaxana Troi comes aboard the Enterprise and sets her sights on Captain Picard. Aiming to be a light comedic episode, Manhunt has some promising setups, like Jean-Luc inviting Data to be a third wheel during his dinner with Luoxana, but stretches the jokes and scenes to embarrassing lengths until all the humour has been drained away. For example, it's initially amusing to see Data drone on about various scientific theories, but it soon begins to feel like being trapped with a jokey uncle who won't stop bombarding you with puns. It's also tough to be entertained at Picard's clear discomfort at Miss Troy's advances, making us wish the awkwardness would just end. This leads to a second half set mostly on the holodeck, where Picard decides to have some fun in a detective simulation while hiding from Luoxana. It begins nicely with a fun bit about the scene being too violent for Picard, when a gangster pulls a machine gun, prompting the captain to reset the program to a milder setting. Yet this gag, including the entire setup with the secretary telling Jean-Luc he has a client, gets redone 3 whole times. It's like watching the opening minute of a wrestling match on a loop. Adding a simple mystery for Picard to solve could have given Patrick Stewart some fun material to play with and made this entire sequence more entertaining. Instead, the entire holodeck sequence feels like a desperate attempt to pad out the running time. Manhunt might have worked as a half-hour comedy, but there just isn't enough here for a whole hour, ultimately making it a giant piece of filler. Number 9. Cupid. If you dreamed of seeing Captain Jean-Luc Picard brandishing a sword as Robin Hood, then this is the episode for you. The Enterprise is hosting an archaeological summit, and one of the delegates is Vash, an old flame of Picard, previously seen in Captain's Holiday, who is looking to rekindle that spark when Q arrives and transports them all to a fantasy version of Sherwood Forest. The first problem with Cupid is that Vash is an unlikable guest star coming off as self-centered and selfish. Upon arriving at the Enterprise, she is immediately taken aback by the fact that no one has ever heard of her. She gets annoyed at Picard for not telling anyone about their history, which is a foolish expectation since there is no reason for the captain of the ship to share such personal details with the crew. The second and bigger issue is that the Nottingham parts are devoid of laughs. The crew plays various recognisable supporting characters, as Data, for instance, is Friar Tuck, but are given nothing to do but smirk in the background. In fact, the entire setting gets squandered with unimaginative plotting that simply has Picard sneak into the castle to save Vash, and rote action scenes which feel like a poor man's version of The Princess Bride. Worf, the warrior of the group, swings his sword in such a clunky manner you worry he might hurt himself, while Picard as Robin Hood doesn't even get to shoot an arrow. It's just all so lazily executed that Cupid ends up straying far wide of its target. Number 8. Angel 1. Riker attempts to negotiate the release of Federation prisoners who crashed on Angel 1, an oppressive matriarchal society. A big issue is that we never get to see the type of oppression the males in this planet suffer because none of them are given any substantial roles. They are just butlers in the background who don't seem to be complaining and who even look content, making it hard to understand and sympathise with this race. Meanwhile, the Federation survivors, led by Ramsey, have been sentenced to death for supposedly contaminating the local culture with their ideas about equality, but we never see this either. Ramsey is called a revolutionary, but there is no moment where he is influencing others or spreading his message, making him a boring character who seems to only want to stay because he found himself a wife. The main moralizing comes from William Riker, who lectures Beata, the government head, with basic lessons about equal treatment and sharing responsibility that we've heard hundreds of times before. Simply switching the genders doesn't automatically make the lessons fresh. Riker also gets physically intimate with Beata, making us wonder if it's ethically okay for him to sleep with beautiful heads of state during diplomatic missions. Finally, there is a virus outbreak in the Enterprise that shuts down most of the crew. It's mostly played for laughs, with Captain Jean-Luc Picard itching and laying sick in bed, and Worf sneezing his guts out, which is not exactly the kind of riveting TV we want to see. That, combined with the rote storyline on the surface, ensure that there is nothing angelic about the stay in Angel 1. Number 7. Aquiel. When the Enterprise finds an isolated relay station missing its 2 staff members, the ensuing investigation leads them to consider the possibility of murder. The episode is built on the emotional connection between Geordi and Lieutenant Aquiel, but there is no spark to be found between the two. Geordi first develops feelings while watching the presumed dead officer's personal logs in moments that are framed as sweet but which instead look like an unhealthy obsession. Later, Aquiel is discovered alive in a nearby shuttle, thus becoming the murder suspect, and the smitten Geordie becomes determined to prove her innocence. They become closer for real, but lack chemistry, with LeVar Burton acting more like an overeager schoolboy desperate to please his crush. In addition, he is obviously too emotionally attached to the case to be objective, making it even harder to invest in their relationship and whether she's really the killer. What really sinks the episode, though, is the wholly unsatisfying final reveal. It's shown that the true culprit is an alien that takes on the appearance of the victim it absorbs, and after it murdered the crew, it took the form of Aquiel's dog. That's right, the dog did it. Worse, the shapeshifter just shows itself to Geordie in its quarters for no apparent reason other than the episode is almost over. Geordie doesn't solve the mystery or discover any key clue, the answer simply materializes in front of him, ending the story in an unearned, lifeless manner. Aquiel does seem like a nice girl though, and hopefully fares better in her next assignment. Number 6. The Royale. After encountering debris from a 21st century Earthship orbiting an uninhabitable planet, Riker, Data and Worf beam down to an anomalous area and discover an alien approximation of a 20th century casino hotel. It turns out an astronaut survived the mishap ages ago, and aliens built him this simulation based on a trashy novel he owned. There is a poignant idea here about how a supposed act of penance turned into a form of torture for the survivor who was forced to witness the novel on a loop for the rest of his life, but it's brushed over too quickly for it to have any emotional resonance. The majority of the runtime is spent with Riker and the away team witnessing the novel with its cliché gangster archetypes, like Mickey D, who longs for his dame Rita, and laughable dialogue like, "No woman's worth dying for, killing for, not dying for." The characters constantly comment on how hackneyed and terrible the story and scripts are, but the criticisms lack the needed wit to be entertaining. Simply saying that what we are watching is bad doesn't make it good or any less wearisome to watch. There is also a distinct lack of desperation or even frustration at their plight, as Riker and the away team just casually explore, resulting in zero suspense. They are unable to leave, beam out or communicate with the Enterprise, but don't seem the least bit worried. Riker eventually figures out that the way to escape is to play a role in the novel's plot and buy the casino in order for the story to reach its conclusion, leading to a climactic game of cards that doesn't exactly fire up the screen with excitement. With a distinct lack of wonder and intrigue, the Royale proves to be a world which we too can't wait to escape. Number 5. Cost of living. On the eve of her wedding, Lwaxana Troi comes aboard the Enterprise and interferes with Deanna and Worf's attempts to teach his brat son Alexander discipline. Pairing two of the Next Generation's most annoying recurring guests, Lwaxana and Alexander, and having them explore one of the show's worst holodeck programs, a kind of intergalactic circus, is a recipe for catastrophe. Lwaxana acts like a crazy aunt, encouraging Alexander to disobey authority and just have fun, even exposing him to striptease-like dancers, while Alexander is rude and whiny, making us want to slap him. They are intentionally irritating, but with no likeable characters to provide a balance, they become a burden to watch. Meanwhile, poor Worf is thoroughly disrespected with the episode, making a mockery of his attempts to teach his son boundaries. He is constantly undermined by Lwaxana, who makes light of his lessons, encouraging the young boy not to take his father seriously, all culminating in a mud bath that scrapes away Worf's last ounce of dignity. The main drama is whether free spirit Lwaxana will settle for her stiff fiancé or stay single and liberated. That she agreed to marry him in the first place feels out of character. She does realise their marriage is doomed from the start, but instead of communicating this to him, she makes a spectacle of herself, sabotaging the wedding by marching naked to the altar. The music and bemused look of the crew frame it like some heroic moment rather than the horror show that it is. There is also a perfunctory metal parasite slowly eating away at the ship, which is treated as an afterthought for most of the episode, before rapidly escalating in the last act into a race against time to save the Enterprise from being destroyed. It's hard to suddenly care about this subplot when it was given zero importance in the first half. Ultimately, Cost of Living doesn't succeed as a drama, comedy, or sci-fi disaster, making it not worth the cost of watching. Number 4. Justice. While on a utopian world inhabited by the Edo race, Wesley accidentally commits a trifling offense and gets sentenced to die. The Edo's customs, costumes, and way of speaking immediately invite ridicule. They are barely covered in skimpy white cloth, run to all of their destinations with silly smiles on their faces, and play simplistic games like tossing a ball to each other while giggling. None of them seem to have any job or purpose to their life other than frivolous entertainment, as they just frolic and make love all day, making them look like simpletons whose joy is superfluous and manufactured. Because their pleasure feels so vacuous, we end up laughing at them throughout. While playing catch with local teens, Wesley mistakenly crashes into some plants in a forbidden flower bed. It turns out that here, every crime, no matter how trivial, automatically receives the death penalty. This leads to a whiplash-inducing shift in tone as we jump to the serious issue of how the crew can save Wesley while still honouring the Prime Directive and Edo laws. It leads to a lot of talky debate, but crucial evidence is lacking as the Edo are unable to make a good case for why the death penalty is necessary, or why it works so well in deterring crime. They say it just does. Picard makes a good point about how justice shouldn't be absolute, but the Edo still refuse to spare Wesley, which leads to a big flaw in the climax, in that Picard takes Wesley back to the Enterprise in violation of the Edo Constitution. Star Trek The Next Generation is about diplomacy triumphing, but here there is a failure to reach a mutual agreement, so the actions of the crew come off as disrespectful, neutering the intended message and making the Prime Directive seem optional. It's like saying we'll respect your laws only as long as it suits us. This lack of a satisfying resolution results in a lack of justice, making the episode guilty of failure. Number 3. Sub Rosa. On a Federation colony modelled after Scotland, Crusher attends her grandmother's funeral where she is drawn into a bizarre relationship with a ghost after she finds out that her ancestral home is being haunted by a phantom named Ronan, called an anaphasic lifeform but clearly a ghost, who has been debauching the women of the Crusher family for generations and cohabiting their bodies. Sub Rosa tries to mix in some elements from other genres like horror and mild erotica, but only takes the most cliché and laughable components like eerie noises in a dark abandoned mansion, lightning and thunder jolting the windows, and cheap jump scares where something suddenly appears in the mirror. This makes it nigh impossible to take any of the drama seriously because it all feels so over the top and campy. The performances throughout also fail to jolt any life into the proceedings. Duncan Regeer goes all out with his facial expressions and delivery, which combined with the soap opera dialogue effectively rips viewers' souls out. Meanwhile, Paul Gates McFadden is clearly uncomfortable in this role as she writhes and moans, attempting to show horror and pleasure at being seduced by a spirit. Their moments together play like a bad episode of Days of Our Lives, with their attempts at creating sexual tension not even generating enough energy to power a nightlight. As for the rest of the cast, they seem at a loss with how to approach the material, and become trapped in a limbo between going broad or staying subdued. Sub Rosa does have some so bad it's good moments, like an over-the-top graveyard finale straight out of a bad B-movie horror feature, but overall, it's dead on arrival. Number 2. Code of Honor. The Enterprise is attempting to open diplomatic relations with the Ligonians, a patriarchal race that values adherence to honourable customs and who possess a vital vaccine. One of their rituals involves their leader, Lutan, proving his heroism by kidnapping the riskiest target, Lieutenant Yar. Code of Honor moves at a glacial pace as Picard tries to figure out how to get her back without offending the Ligonians. We are fed loads of detail about their culture through exposition without experiencing it for ourselves, making learning about them as interesting as a school lecture, while the feeling out process between Lutan and Picard seems to take forever. It is played as a battle of wills between two smart leaders, but their supposed surprise moves are obvious, making the characters instead look dumb for falling for them. In addition, the guest characters are barely developed. Lutan never grows beyond over-the-top evil villain. His wife Yarina, who hisses her lines in an attempt at feistiness, plays a key role, but we don't see what kind of life she is living under him, making her motives a mystery. There is a bevy of technical shortcomings as well, like the staging of Yar's kidnapping. When Lutan grabs her, the rest of the crew watch like statues until the two have teleported away, before suddenly moving like mimes springing to life, making it all look staged. The climactic fight to the death is even more egregious, as we can see the actors anticipating the next moves before they are made, making it look obviously scripted. With such glaring flaws, the most honourable thing to do is to skip Code of Honor. Number 1. Shades of Grey. When William Riker gets infected by foreign parasites on an alien planet that looks more like a soundstage, the only method to repel them is to induce him to relive his past experiences, with happy memories strengthening the parasites and painful ones weakening them. Basically, it's a clip show. The big issue, though, is the absence of any new revelation about Riker or any character growth that happens from remembering these moments. There is nothing for him to reflect on upon waking up, making it a boring and pointless trudge through memory lane. To make matters worse, most of the scenes are from the most awful episodes so far, torturing us by making us relive such painful events. The framing scenes between flashbacks occur mostly in sickbay, exposing the episode's lack of resources while filling our ears with repetitive dialogue. The conversations between Troy and Dr. Pulaski feel like an endless loop as they regurgitate the same info about how there is no cure for the parasite and that memories are the key to saving Riker. Meanwhile, the cinematography is bland, constantly utilising basic shots from the same angles, and the set looks bare with nothing but a medical bed and some computers revealing that this was all shot cheaply and in a rush. To top it off, there is a droning musical score which feels more suitable for a hypnosis session as it keeps repeating the same 3 notes. It's apparent that Shades of Grey exists solely to meet the required season episode count and is thus wholly unworthy of being remembered.
The holodeck can be an absolutely wonderful thing when it's used right or when it's used in a way that benefits the episode. This is not that list. This is Sean Ferrick for TrekCulture, and here are the 10 worst holodeck episodes. Number 10, Star Trek Insurrection. Yes, this is a movie. This entry is here because it stands out in how Starfleet operates. If we compare it to another story that sees mass transport of people, The Next Generation's Homeward, that case saw a people taken into the holodeck to save their lives. This was done under duress as Nikolai Roshenko managed to transport people without the Enterprise detecting it. In Insurrection, Starfleet is utilizing cloaking technology, the first big issue here, and engaging in forced resettlement. The resettlement story feels like a retread of Journey's End, while the cloaking technology feels like the writers simply forgot about the Treaty of Algernon. Then there is the holodeck within the holoship itself. It's unlike previous holodecks the audience has seen, which isn't a crime. What is a crime is the inconsistent rules. Does it work properly or not? Are those sonar guards holograms or not? It's not like we're against the idea of holoships, and quite frankly they could be fun, but the biggest issue with this story is that it simply raises too many questions, all for, seemingly, the chance to do a cool. Number 9, Spirit Folk, Voyager. I'm going to draw on all of the goodwill that I've ever built up in Ireland as I make this shocking statement. While yes, Spirit Folk most certainly does belong on this list, it's really not quite as bad as people might think. While that statement alone might get me flagged at customs the next time I try to travel anywhere, this episode has definite strong points. The musical score by Jay Chataway is absolutely gorgeous, and everyone involved commits wholeheartedly to the point. While the Irish accents are about as good as Tom Cruise in Far and Away, this isn't done with a sense of meanness to proceedings. Look, it's never going to rank as one of the best episodes. There's a little too much twee and fiddle-dee-dee going on, but there is a sort of innocence to it that certainly helps. Richard Really may be as Irish as the British Crown, but he's charming and lovable at the same time. Now, there's still a question in there. Would Maggie O'Halloran have kissed Harry back? Number 8, Author, Voyager. I know this one might raise a few eyebrows. Generally, EMH-centric episodes tend to be quite good. Author, on its own merit, isn't a bad episode. There's an engaging story, the regulars get to act in new ways, and there's even a trial to evoke the measure of a man to boot. Therein lies the issue. There's no hiding the fact that Author is an attempt to redo Data's trial to assess his sentience, and this version of the story fails to live up to the original. Added to this, there is no clear ruling by the episode's close. That's to say nothing of the reveal that the EMH Mark I program is now used as slave labour in the Federation. The episode starts as a fun romp through the holodeck before becoming something a little darker and even nastier by the end. This was unfortunately one of a string of episodes in Voyager's final season that felt like padding for time, only with this one it casually stated that holograms still aren't considered sentient beings despite dozens of examples to the contrary. Number 7, Emergence, The Next Generation. As The Next Generation was rounding out its final season, one would assume that they would try to go out on a high. When it comes to both preemptive strike and all good things, there was no question that they succeeded. Sadly, the same cannot be said of Emergence. As the third to last episode, was it truly necessary to see a story that suggested the Enterprise itself was becoming sentient? Or that aside, spending the entire 40 minutes moving from one train carriage to another on the holographic Orient Express? While the train is certainly the derailment of the episode, pause for laugh, the opening scene wherein Data plays Prospero hero from Shakespeare's The Tempest shows off Spiner's range and comedy skill at the same time. The biggest crime in the episode that follows is that it's a bit of a slog. While the train sets are quite pleasant and very little else about the episode is, there is an appearance by the Paramount Studios lot as well, one that would become only too familiar to viewers as the franchise went on. Emergence isn't a terrible episode by any means, it's where it falls in the episode order for the Next Generation's victory lap that truly lets it down. Number 6, A Matter of Perspective, The Next Generation. While this episode granted audience the gift of the Riker facepalm meme, there is an undeniable fact that, despite the best attempts of all involved, it simply doesn't come together as it should. The holodeck here is used as a tool to tell several versions of the same story. This is a trope that's been used in media before and is often a successful way of addressing differing stories. Yet this episode, despite its multitude of plot twists, just sits in that middle section of fine. The true issue, perhaps, is that the mystery isn't all that interesting enough to sustain the case. The audience knows Riker didn't kill anyone. The audience knows that nothing is going to come of this. So dragging out the reveal at the end makes this episode feel like a bottle show crafted to save money, and perhaps rather cynically, one could assume that it was a cost-cutting exercise for yesterday's Enterprise, which would be the next episode in production order. But to end on a positive, we did get that Riker facepalm, so that makes up for things a little. Number 5, Fairhaven, Voyager. Fairhaven is a bit of an oddity. While Spirit Folk has an air of well-intentioned nonsense to it, which I say as an Irishman, Fairhaven is a bit murkier. There's not one thing wrong with wanting to create a nice Irish village for the crew to relax in, nor is it wrong to want to reuse the Great Village set, one that audiences first saw in The Killing Game. Fairhaven stumbles because of the tired Irish stereotypes that it employs. Added to this, however, is the odd decision to make Janeway, one of the strongest champions of rights in the franchise, someone who deems being a lowly innkeeper beneath her. Sure, delete the wife became an iconic joke, served as an inspiration for some fairly fun cosplay at conventions, but Janeway completely rewriting Michael's character to better suit her just seemed quite out of character. We must also bear in mind that Star Trek Voyager, out of all of the series, was the one that spent time championing holographic rights via the character of the EMH. The story concludes with the program having to be rewritten, which makes the entire outing feel a bit pointless. Number 4, Once Upon a Time, Voyager. This is one of those episodes that has a truly heartwarming message at its core, though in the execution it stumbles toward the finish line. Who exactly is this episode about? On the surface, surely it concerns Naomi Wildman and learning to deal with the possibility her mother isn't coming home. Perhaps it could be about the dangers of serving in Starfleet with a family to worry about, much like The Next Generation's The Bonding. And then the episode switches to Neelix and ends up as something of a rehash or reminder of the first season's Jetrel. Again, that doesn't make this entry a bad episode, so to speak, simply a very muddled one. There are too many ideas going on for it to make a satisfactory whole. Even the inclusion of the nightmare-inducing ogre of fire isn't enough to save it, although it does make for a very informative lesson. Scarlet Palmers is a welcome addition to the crew as Naomi Wildman, and it was nice to see Ensign Samantha Wildman back again, but overall this story was a bit too light for what it set out to achieve, relying a little too heavily on the holodeck in the end without the backup it needed. Number 3, The Fight, Voyager. Perhaps it's a little generous to describe The Fight as a holodeck episode, though to be fair, I'm not entirely sure if any category would want it in their camp. The qualifier for including it here is that the set in which the majority of the action takes place, the boxing ring, makes its first appearance as a holodeck recreation. That good enough for everyone? Chakotay episodes tended to swing for the fences as Voyager went on through its 7-year run. Coming in the 5th season, this episode is a really good example of nothing really happening to affect anything overall. While the appearance of Ray Walston's Boothby is always welcome, the entire subplot of Chakotay's grandfather losing his mind and then his grandson's fear of that happening to him never goes anywhere. It would also mark the first and only reference to Chakotay's boxing days in the series. If perhaps anything had come of this episode, then it might be excusable, but instead we're siding with Kid Chaos in this one. Knock the Mackie Mauler out and be quick about it. Number 2, Booby Trap, The Next Generation. Booby Trap is an episode that was handled poorly during its production and release, and the years that have passed have not been kind to it. It really is a shame because there are certainly strong points to the story, but then we get the whole Geordie on the holodeck thing. To be fair, LeVar Burton hated this storyline, and the subsequent episode Galaxy's Child. The issue lies in how the writers handled his relationship with Leah Brahms. In this episode, she was created to be an interface with whom he could work, enjoying a one-to-one with a person instead of the off off-screen voice of the main computer. However, Leah here is presented as something close to a slave with amorous intent and is shown stroking the back of Geordi's neck. This is the scientist who we are told designed the main engines on the Galaxy-class ship. Gosh, isn't it great she can have a career and please a man? It was not handled or presented well, which makes this an uncomfortable watch. In the follow-up, when the real Dr. Brahms discovers the program, Geordi is shown getting angry at her for feeling that way, as opposed to facing the inappropriate actions themselves. All things considered, neither episode are Star Trek's best. Number 1, these are the voyages. Enterprise. Presumably, this will surprise absolutely no one. These Are the Voyages aired as the final episode in Star Trek Enterprise's run and was designed as a love letter to that entire era of Trek from 1987 until 2005. However, rather than serving as a crowd-pleasing send-off, it instead offered a rather ignoble end to the cast of characters. There are truly any number of reasons to choose from. We could go with Trip's death, we could address Riker's odd interactions with T'Pol. There's the thought of sandwiching this story into the Pegasus, one of the Next Generation's strongest episodes from its final season. Instead, we'll simply use this example. Captain Jonathan Archer hugs T'Pol, ascends the steps to deliver one of the most iconic speeches in Federation history, and then before he gets a chance to open his mouth, Riker ends the program and Star Trek Enterprise just ends. Even with that closing passage showing Picard, Kirk and Archer's Enterprises one after the other, it was a jarring ending to the series that deserved better. And though perhaps as a standalone event it could have been an interesting what if, instead it serves as a damp squib of an ending to the final Trek series of that era.
Generally, you can tell a good twist when the audience enjoys it, usually when the creative team enjoys it, and most often when the actors enjoy it. When that doesn't happen, sometimes that might lead us to question the wisdom of the twist itself. And before we go on, this is not just a list of 10 things Robert Beltran didn't like in Star Trek Voyager. That's going to be its own list. With that in mind, I'm Sean Ferrick for TrekCulture, and here are 10 Star Trek twists that the actors hated. Number 10. Garak murders Weyoun in cold blood. Jeffrey Combs. No one is going to say in front of me that What You Leave Behind is not a terrific episode, but there is one actor who didn't like one aspect of the episode, and that is the main Vorta himself, Jeffrey Combs. When Garak, Kira and Damar's troops storm Dominion headquarters, Garak and Kira are effectively the only ones who make it as far as the main control center. Now, in there, they find a couple of Jem'Hadar, the female changeling, and of course, Weyoun. Weyoun sardonically asks, where is his old friend Damar? He would really like to see him again. Garak says, he's dead. Weyoun decides to insult Cardassia. Oh, Weyoun. Garak pulls out his phaser and shoots him in cold blood. Now, while that may seem like a fairly standard Tuesday for a Garak action, Jeffrey Combs was not thrilled with how his character was written out of the show. Frankly, he wanted to have some sort of struggle that ended up with him killed in the course of that. Now, Weyoun was never a fighter, so potentially it could have been him ordering his troops to continue the assault on Cardassia or telling the Jem'Hadar to fight to the bitter end in orbit of the planet. But no, he says the wrong thing at the wrong time and he gets shot for it. And for Combs, he was a bit bummed with that. But he did recognise that for Garak's character, it was perfect. He just wished he didn't have to be on the receiving end of that phaser. Number 9. Sulu is gay. George Takei. In Star Trek Beyond, it was announced that one of the characters was going to be LGBT as a celebration of many things, really, but George Takei's activism for the Gay Rights Alliance was part of the reason. So they chose Sulu to be that character. Now, George Takei famously came out of the closet in the mid-2000s, having had to have spent all of his time acting as Sulu, effectively both in the closet and also kind of publicly closeted. He had spoken to Gene Roddenberry about it, and he had spoken to Gene Roddenberry about the idea of introducing gay characters. Gene apparently said that he wanted to do that, but he was faced with the limitations of what the network would allow. One might assume that Takei would be overjoyed that Star Trek Beyond was not only featuring a gay character, but that his own character's namesake, if you like, was going to be the one chosen for this. However, he thought it was very unfortunate. You see, whatever else Takei is, he is someone who absolutely respects the vision of Gene Roddenberry, and in Gene Roddenberry's vision, Hikaru Sulu was straight. Simon Pegg, who co-wrote Star Trek Beyond, respectfully disagreed in the media, saying that just because a character had never openly acknowledged their sexuality before, it didn't make it a retcon to make Sulu gay now. For example, on screen, we never saw Demora Sulu's mother in the Prime universe, whereas we see Demora as a little girl in Star Trek Beyond. So it really comes down to a case of, we can respect Takei's opinion of wanting to keep Roddenberry's legacy going. We can respect Pegg's opinion of it doesn't necessarily make it a retcon to introduce a new aspect of a character, and it may have to be an agree to disagree moment. Let us know what you thought in the comments. Number 8. Captain Kirk falls to his death. William Shatner. Star Trek Generations, it gets a lot of hate. Now, personally, I think it's aged very well. I remember seeing it in the cinema when I was a little boy, and I remember seeing it on Blu-ray a couple of days ago. I have continued watching this movie ever since. I have a lot of fond memories for it. Having said that, I can understand that Captain Kirk has a very small role in this film, which is effectively to die. Rick Berman wanted this film to be a Next Generation film, but when they were breaking the story front, Ronald D. Moore, Brannon Braga, they wanted to have a passing of the torch, and they originally envisioned Spock, Kirk, and McCoy appearing in the film. Now, for various reasons, Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelley were not in the film, but William Shatner signed on. Now, the way he described it is that he was given an option. You can appear in the film and die, or you can not appear in the film and die. So, not liking the script, not particularly liking the direction the character was taken, he did like the money. So he's openly taken it for the cash. Now, William Shatner has never been shy about expressing his opinions on Star Trek, but he did seem to have extra opinions on this because he felt that Kirk was an American TV icon, to the point where he asked Malcolm McDowell while writing one of his memoirs, how did it feel to kill an American TV icon? McDowell had some comments. Number 7, Voyager's sudden return home, Robert Beltran. Now, we were always going to get to Robert Beltran on this list because he has been, on the one hand, he's been refreshingly honest in how he felt about the decisions that were made on Star Trek Voyager. He, if he didn't like something, he would say it, and he would also say it publicly, which, as the consuming mass, I have to say, I have enjoyed reading some of those quotes sometimes. On the other hand, he got himself a bit of a reputation for a whinger. I think there is merit to some of the complaints that he had, that some of the characters were left a bit short in the later seasons. That is true. That Chakotay's character kind of wandered toward the end. That is true. And also, he was very unhappy with Endgame as a finale. The episode is really good if you enjoy Janeway, the Doctor, and Seven of Nine. It's not as good if you are looking for a big Chakotay story or a big Harry Kim story. He's there, he gets a few moments. But Beltran went on to say, this is what we're going out on? Voyager suddenly comes across this magic portal in space that brings them right back to their doorstep, and then there's no time whatsoever to even ruminate on the fact that they're back in the Alpha Quadrant. It's a bit understandable. The entire 7 years of this show was about Voyager's journey to get home. However, I don't think anybody expected the last shot to be getting home. We thought possibly we get a little bit of a breathing time. Now, this is something that we are really looking forward to seeing discussed in the upcoming documentary, To the Journey, which was made by the same people as made What We Left Behind, and I am so excited. Number 6, Tasha Yar dies, Patrick Stewart. Denise Crosby, of course, originated the role of Tasha Yar in Encounter at Farpoint, and she played her for most of the first season of The Next Generation. While she did return for 2 other episodes as Tasha Yar, and of course 2 other episodes as Commander Sela, 3 unifications to her, she wasn't happy when it got to the end of season 1. She felt that she was effectively just set dressing. That all she did was open hailing frequencies, fire the odd torpedo, and that was pretty much it. In fact, she said that if they had painted a mural of her legs and slotted it in behind Picard's head, that would have done pretty much the same job that she was doing on the set of the bridge. She went to Gene Roddenberry and she said she wanted out. She was a bit fed up and she wanted to see other, career possibilities. Gene decided that he would shock the audience by killing her off in a brutal, sudden fashion, which of course he did in the episode Skin of Evil. And there was one person who was very unhappy about this. Patrick Stewart described the decision to axe Denise Crosby as a huge mistake, a complete failure on the parts of pretty much everyone on the negotiating team. I mean, with some obvious exceptions, think of how many people have left the show with open-ended, invites to come back. This was pretty definitive, and it took a lot of dimension hopping to get her back. Number 5, Spock can't tell the difference? Leonard Nimoy. Star Trek: The Original Series' 3rd season is a mixed bag. It's got some classic episodes. Let That Be Your Last Battlefield is flipping brill. It's also got Spock's brain. So, you take the bad with the good here. Whom Gods Destroy comes in somewhere in the middle. We get introduced to Garth of Izar, who of course would go on to be a fairly large character in a fairly well-known fan production online. But what's more than that is we get some immortal lines. For example, we have Kirk and a duplicate Kirk standing in front of Spock, one of whom says, "Shoot us both, Spock." And there you go, straight away, that's Kirk, that's the smart thing to do. Kirk would never put anyone in danger. Great. Leonard Nimoy was not happy that this is what it took to convince Spock of who the real Kirk was. He felt, and expressed his feelings in several memos at the time, that Spock would know his captain. He would know him well enough that he wouldn't have to resort to guessing games, which is what happens in the episode. In the end, he asks whoever the real Kirk is going to be to give the answer to the call sign up to the Enterprise, which lets the Enterprise know it's safe to beam down. It's a chess move. Now, Garth, in Kirk's form, says, "Oh, any captain could guess that, that means nothing." And there's a bit of that, so Spock decides to sit down and kind of chill out. It is a very strange decision for the character, and, well, he gets a chair across the head for it. So maybe Nimoy shouldn't have put it in those memos? Number 4, Archer lets the Valakians die, John Billingsley. Dear Doctor is actually one of the better episodes of Star Trek Enterprise's first season, or of course Enterprise as it was called then. It's an epistolary episode where Phlox is really front and center. The Valakians and the Menk are 2 species that share the same planet, one of whom is effectively subservient to the other, but the other being at an evolutionary dead end. They're all sick and they're all dying, and of course they're crying out for help. Dr. Phlox manages to find a cure is potentially the wrong description for it, because in the same way that Storm in X-Men 3, yes, that is actually a film, says there's nothing to cure because there's nothing wrong with us. Technically, it's the same situation here. They've just reached the end of the road. In the original script, Dr. Phlox found this cure and elected not to give it to them or to let anybody know that he had found it because he felt it would be messing with nature. However, the network had no interest in another character taking the central stage at this point in the show. They wanted it to be on Archer. Now, while Archer ends up making the decision not to give this treatment to the Valakians, Billingsley felt it weakened Phlox a little bit that he had to run to his captain and, couldn't make a decision for himself. While it was a big decision, he much preferred the original ending, and I have to be honest, I agree with the man. I think it would have made Phlox a lot more complicated as a character. Number 3, Dr. Bashir's genetic enhancements, Alexander Siddig. This is a little bit of a muddling one, because while the genetic enhancements would go on to become a large part of Dr. Bashir's story for seasons 6 and 7 of Deep Space Nine, they were effectively a Friday night decision the Monday before the episode was due to shoot. Now, okay, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but Alexander Siddig describes it as incredibly late in the day that he was told about this decision for the character. Ira Stephen Bear, for example, says that while they were midway through the season and writing In Purgatory's Shadow by Inferno's Light, they had no idea that Bashir was genetically engineered. However, just a couple of episodes later, in Dr. Bashir, I presume, this big revelation comes out that technically Bashir's been living a lie the whole time. Now, while this is an aspect of the character that deserved exploration and gave characters a great time to shine, Siddig was incredibly pissed off that he was given such little notice for such a polar change in his character. Dr. Bashir up to that point had just been eager and really, really bright. He'd mellowed a little bit over the years, but that's what he was. Now, he was being asked to play this character who had actually been hiding the secret for the entirety of the show, and also he was being given only a few days' notice to imbue that in his performance. He was not happy, not in the revelation itself, but in the way that it was all written and the way that it was all handled. Number 2, Icheb's fate, Manu Intiraymi. Stardust City Rag was a fairly shocking episode of Star Trek Picard. It opens with the brutal death of Icheb and also concludes with Seven shooting someone in cold blood. This isn't the Star Trek I remember when I was a kid. But it was a bold new direction to take the characters in. 20 years have gone by. Guys, stuff happens. People change. Arguably, Icheb changed more than anyone because he had a completely different face in this episode. In fact, it was Casey King. It wasn't Manu Intiraymi at all. Over the years, Intiraymi has had a couple of public personal issues that effectively barred him from being invited back onto the show. He was quite upset about this and made his feelings known on Twitter. While one of the personal issues involved conflict with another actor, they have since resolved that, but it was too late for Icheb. Therefore, when Icheb was seen having his eye pulled out of his body and then euthanized by Seven, this to Intiraymi was a kick in the teeth. It closed the door on him ever returning to Star Trek, and frankly, it hurt him. People seem quite divided on how they feel about whether they should have brought him back, if it was just for a cameo, or nope, producers made the exact right decision. What do you think? Let us know in the comments below if you think that it was right not to bring him back, or if they should have brought him for just that scene. What I think about that scene is that I was not ready to see an eyeball being pulled out first thing in a Star Trek episode. Number 1, Jadzia dies. Terry Farrell. This is potentially one of the greatest injustices in Star Trek, and I realize that's a hell of a statement, so please feel free to drop some sort of drop some other injustices into the comments below. But for this one, this is such a shame because it was handled so badly. Terry Farrell, after 6 years of starring on Deep Space Nine, she wanted to throttle back a little bit. She didn't want to be front and center starring role in every episode. She approached Rick Berman and the producers and asked if she could either move down to a recurring role or even a guest starring role. They flatly denied. Now that left her in an awkward position. She was basically given a take it or leave it. It was you are either in every episode of season 7 or you are in no episodes of season 7. That's it. And she wasn't given long to decide. Now she described as well a situation, a very nasty situation that arose where she would be getting ready to film a scene and the phone would ring and it would be the producers going, "Have you decided yet? Have you decided yet? What's going on?" And she said it was horrible, to the point where she said, "Fine, I'm out. Maybe you could leave the door open." Jadzia Dax is to date the only main Star Trek character who's been killed off and hasn't returned in some form. She was also not featured in the montage in What You Leave Behind, whereas Nicole DeBer's Ezri Dax was. I love Ezri, by the way, no hate. It was a poorly handled situation, it was a rotten twist, and to be honest, yep, she's got every right to feel pretty pissed off about that one.
When the USS Voyager is enveloped by a powerful energy wave that strands it in the galaxy's unexplored Delta Quadrant, the crew find themselves more than 70,000 light years from Earth and now have to embark on an estimated 75-year journey back home, unless they happen upon a transwarp network or something, with no Federation to rely on whilst encountering numerous strange alien life forms along the way. While some believe it's not as popular as its contemporaries Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Voyager did manage to carve out a nice niche for itself, building a loyal following owing to some memorable encounters, most notably with the Borg, and a likeable cast of characters led by the competent Captain Janeway, the funny Doctor, and the sultry Seven of Nine. Now, personally, I like most of the 172 episodes, but there are some out there that didn't go down as well as Janeway's first cup of coffee of the day. So let's get it out of our system. We love Star Trek, we love Voyager, but it's time to pull yourself a Steiner haterade, pop your feet up, because I, Marcus Bronzy, on behalf of TrekCulture, I'm going to give you 10 of the most hated Star Trek Voyager episodes ever.
Hello, I'm Ensign Tom Larkin. More and more of you have been reaching out to me for some of our elixirs and recipes, so I've teamed up with Squarespace to create Don't Tell Starfleet, a members-only website. Thanks to Squarespace's beautiful and powerful online interface, once you join up, you can get access to our mailing list and we can send you ideas such as my brother Eddie's lovely breakfast recipe, Sugared Suliban Surprise. You can also comment on blog posts where we break down the science of what it is that we do, and also you can see your social media posts included on the site as well. Don't forget to include the hashtag DTS. To give all this a go and perhaps set up something of your own, head on over to www.squarespace.com/TrekCulture and you'll get a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. Also, if you set up your own website, you'll be able to connect with your audience and generate revenue through gated members-only content. Manage your members, send email communications, and leverage audience insights all on one easy-to-use platform. That's www.squarespace.com/TrekCulture. Come be a part of the movement, and remember, don't tell Starfleet.
Number 10, The Fight, Season 5, Episode 18. When Voyager gets trapped in a chaotic space where the laws of physics simply don't apply, the key to its escape lies within Chakotay, who has to decipher strange visions after he begins hallucinating due to a mental hereditary defect getting stimulated by the aliens. These dreamlike scenes utilize dark lighting, offbeat camera angles, and some distorted imagery like a disintegrating boxing ring to create a nice atmosphere, but they're too obscure in their meaning to land an effective punch. See what I did there? Punch. Boxing ring. Anyway, this denies us any fresh insight into who Chakotay is. Why? Because at some points we're bombarded with rapid cuts to multiple crew members spouting murky dialogue directly at the camera, while at others we have longer yet vague interactions between Chakotay and his grandfather concerning fear, mentor Boothby yelling generic don't give up advice, and even the Doctor played by a hammy Robert Picardo. It does, however, make us experience firsthand the same disorientation that Chakotay is going through, but with no unifying theme and no emotional thread to latch onto. Overall, The Fight makes a valiant attempt to dive deep into Chakotay's psyche, but ultimately loses via unanimous decision. Here all night. Number 9, Elogium. It's Elogium, innit? Season 2, Episode 4. When space-dwelling creatures attack Voyager, their electrophoretic field causes Kes to fall into a premature state of Elogium, her once-in-a-lifetime period of fertilization. This gives her and Neelix 50 hours to decide whether or not they're ready to be parents. First of all, the premise is illogical, since the Ocampa race would decease by half every generation if women could only give birth once, and she says child. She does not say children, so there is no way they could have developed into an advanced civilization depicted in the show. A bigger issue is that we're not given enough reason to care about Kes and Neelix's dilemma, because their conversations about whether they are prepared enough for the responsibility of having a baby, well, are a standard topic we've heard multiple times before. To make matters worse, after the alien field is repelled, the bizarre aura stops affecting the ship, causing Kes's Elogium to go away and somehow not count, meaning she can have another kid in the future? It's a cop-out ending that completely goes against the rules established at the beginning, making everything that happened feel pointless. Meanwhile, a laugh-inducing subplot concerns a bunch of space protozoa that are sexually attracted to the ship, something that is immediately obvious yet which takes the crew forever to figure out. They thus have to find a way to lower Voyager's sex appeal, so the aliens will leave them alone. This weird narrative combined with Kez and Neelix's aforementioned domestic drama makes Elogium an experience that hopefully doesn't occur twice. Number 8. Unforgettable, Season 4, Episode 22. A mysterious woman named Kellen arrives at Voyager claiming to have a relationship with Chakotay, something he has no memory of since she is a Remorian, a species that emits a pheromone that causes others to forget them in a day or two, and whose central edict doesn't allow its citizens to leave or reveal anything to outsiders. Unforgettable wants to be a swoony romance, but with multiple issues that prevent it from earning our affection. First, the episodic nature of the series means no guest star will end up with a regular cast member, sapping all the suspense and making it difficult to invest in a relationship we know won't last. In addition, Robert Beltran and Virginia Madsen look like performers going through the rigmarole of a relationship script with a lack of chemistry. Another plot thread is concerning a tracer, an agent designed to capture a Remoran runway who infiltrates the ship. This ends up making the Prime Directive feel confusing. This is due to some contradictory actions by Captain Janeway, who initially offers Kellen sanctuary whilst locking the tracer in the brig, but then she lets the tracer out of the brig and then lets him go and take Kellen back, stating that meddling in foreign affairs is against protocols. Overall, Unforgettable fails to craft a memorial romance, with the only silver lining being that the crew will quickly forget this ever happened. Number 7. Rise, Season 3, Episode 19. Rise starts immediately with Tuvok and Neelix crashing into an alien planet where they have no way of contacting Voyager, and which they need to evacuate before being buried by a fallout of an impending asteroid strike. Neelix notices a 300-kilometer tether that he can operate to help them escape, but when he enters the control room, he's taken hostage by Lilias, a woman taking shelter. The execution throughout just sinks the episode, as there is no tension in any scene or situation. Despite all that, Rise could have just stopped at being mediocre, but it keeps piling more and more extra baggage onto the plot. It introduces a murder angle where a character named Vatim is poisoned, Neelix is whining about not receiving enough respect from Tuvok, and there's a conspiracy theory as the crew learns that asteroids are really artificially created weapons. With so many moving parts, none of these plot threads get the development needed to make an impact. It's such a mess that the final scene has Neelix basically spell out the entire plot and connections in a long exposition dump. Further proof that Rise should have been grounded from the start. Number 6. Twisted, Season 2, Episode 6. In this episode, Voyager enters a distortion ring which physically alters the layout of the ship, turning it into a twisted maze the crew must navigate, and each time they try to return to their posts, they end up walking in circles, like back to the holodeck. It's initially interesting, but as we keep watching different officers attempting to get through the labyrinth, it soon becomes more boring than being assigned to the transporter room. Seeing the cast walk through corridor after corridor is highly repetitive. In an effort to generate tension, some poorly conceived conflict between Tuvok and Chakotay concerning the right course of action is tacked on, both of them annoyingly yelling at each other in a forced manner. This feels quite unnatural, as there's no reason for them to be agitated because they're just voicing difference in opinions, which has always been done with respect in previous episodes. As for the actual solution to the puzzle, it turns out Tuvok's suggestion of just doing nothing and waiting for the anomaly to pass works. Everything returns to normal and is correct, which is funny because this course of action would have led to certain death had they done it during any other crisis. The distortion ring does deposit a mysterious mass of data in Voyager's database, and that seems to excite the crew, but it doesn't excite me because that's the last we ever hear of it, so it might as well not exist. Meh. Number 5. Favorite Son, Season 3, Episode 20. After Harry begins experiencing unexpected instincts, he learns that he may actually be the child of a nearby race called the Teresians. Now, this is an implausible premise that turns the crew into imbeciles just so the plot can function, as no one is even suspicious of a species whose plan is to carry an embryo 70,000 light years in the off chance it would become a Starfleet member and miraculously get stranded in the Delta Quadrant. They go to the Teresian homeworld to investigate the claim about Harry, even leaving him to investigate on his own. We then subjected to a barrage of tedious moments with the alien females massaging, caressing and kissing Harry, with the execution as funny as you can imagine. It's painfully obvious that something is amiss, so it turns into a boring wait until it's finally revealed through a mountain of technobabble that Harry is actually the victim of a Teresian virus designed to rewrite his DNA. Not only that, in a last-minute effort to add stakes, they're going to slaughter him and use his raw cells for the females to ensure conception, leading to a standard Voyager rescue operation. It's one of those plots that could have been over immediately if the crew had just said, hang on, sounds a little bit dodgy, let's question these Teresians and plan whether or not to decide to leave one of our crew members alone with them on an alien planet. Number 4, The Disease, Season 5, Episode 16. The Voyager crew are assisting the Varro, a xenophobic species dealing with a dissident internal faction. They need to repair their warp drive in a nice setup that is set aside to focus on Ensign Kim and his torrid love affair with a Varro woman, Tao. Unfortunately, Garrett Wang just can't sell the intense attraction that the romance requires and has a distinct lack of chemistry with Musetta Vanda. Harry and Tao should be bursting with passion to the point of obsession, but instead seem like acquaintances with benefits, in some intimate moments marred by cringy dialogue and awkward delivery. Kim willfully breaks Federation protocols by mingling with an alien without even testing their physiological compatibility, putting their health at risk, resulting in his titular disease. What's more, it doesn't stop there. In a contender for the most unlikable Harry moment of all time, he whines on the bridge about how he's being unfairly separated from his true love when he has done nothing but break every rule. The episode does have some saving graces, mainly when Captain Janeway verbally reprimands Ensign Kim for his foolish behavior, but sadly, it's not enough to cure the disease. Number 3, Spirit Folk Season 6, Episode 17. When a holodeck malfunction makes the Fairhaven citizens more aware of their environment, they begin to realize that they may be inside a computer simulation. The first act is spent watching them react to clues, which quickly becomes boring since we already know the truth, so it just becomes a matter of waiting for them to catch up with the mystery which they repeatedly discuss in redundant dialogue. The crew eventually detects the error in the program, which should have resolved the problem, but they make a parade of idiotic decisions like leaving the simulation running even when not in use and then sending Tom and Harry inside to investigate instead of shutting it down, resulting in them getting captured and taken hostage in said holodeck. Bafflingly, Captain Janeway still refuses to reset the program, stating that though the Fairhaven citizens aren't real, the crew's attachment to them is effectively prioritizing a holodeck simulation over 2 lives of human officers. This makes it impossible to care about the climax, as we have no connection to the holo program and are at this point exasperated because it's their own fault they're in this mess. Spirit Folk should have just been deleted immediately, like when Janeway deleted the wife. Number 2, Demon, Season 4, Episode 24. When Voyager becomes low on a crucial energy source required to keep the ship running, Kim and Paris beam down to a hellish planet in an attempt to retrieve some. Things go just fine. No, of course they don't. They fall into some silver liquid before being rescued, but it turns out the crew took back duplicates who have no idea that they are copies. Sinfully, the idea of the clones coming to terms with the fact that they are not the original is barely explored, since this is only revealed towards the end. For most of the episode, there are barely any hints that we are watching a fake Tom and Paris, or that something is amiss, so there's not a build up to that twist and no chance to develop any paranoia. What's worse is because the truth is only disclosed near the climax, the ensuing conflicts and character dilemmas are all rushed, with the focus more on action and attempts to retrieve the actual crew. This gives us no chance to emotionally sympathize with those replicas. Heartless. Number 1, Threshold, Season 2, Episode 15. After breaking the Warp 10 barrier, Paris undergoes a grotesque metamorphosis in an all-time worst episode of Star Trek. Okay guys, I gotta be honest, I kinda like this one at the same time. Threshold contains an avalanche of techno-babble dialogue inconsistencies, like stating that Warp 10 is theoretically unbreakable, when in TNG, the finale All Good Things, ships in the future are reaching Warp 13, and the pace drags a bit with the bulk of the action taking place in a sickbay where Paris is evolving at a rate of 1,000,000 years in a matter of days, with makeup that really looks more like devolution. Then mutant Paris crosses a whole different type of threshold. He kidnaps Janeway, steals a shuttle, then breaks Warp 10 again with Janeway in said shuttle, obviously. They end up on an obscure planet where Janeway morphs into an amphibious creature as well, and then they have mutant babies together. The crew has no idea where they are, but they magically are able to triangulate their location, and then in the very next scene, Paris and Janeway are back in the sickbay and magically human again. It all plays out like one giant parody. Also, if they can easily reverse the side effects, why not take the Voyager to Warp 10 and then teleport to Earth and reverse any side effects that might be coming on? Frustrating, eh? Woo! Anyway, glad I got that out of my system. Like I said, I love Voyager, so let's not take that too personally, shall we?
When it comes to production, it's fair to say that the hundreds, if not thousands, of people involved used everything available to make it look as real as possible for the audience whenever they could. And some of the finest shots in the franchise were filmed on a shoestring budget, whilst others required the touch of industry leaders like Industrial Light and Magic. ILM gave us the stunning flyby shots of the Enterprise D using a fiberglass model and some fancy camera work. Today, these moments of beauty can be created purely in digital studios, and most of the time they look damned good. But this list is not about those moments. This list is about the other moments. This list is about pixels and renders that for one reason or another just did not come off. These are the 10 worst CGI moments in Star Trek. Number 10, Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, the Genesis wave. I can almost see the comments already. What? How could he? No, that's terrible. What? It's a classic film. Trigger alert. So just to be clear, this is an example of a bad scene from an otherwise fantastic movie. It's widely accepted that Star Trek II Wrath of Khan is one of, if not the best Star Trek film, so aiming criticism at it is a bit sacrilegious. However, fair's fair, and the animation in this scene, come on. It's not ideal, is it? Whilst it's certainly iconic and was reused for Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, it's not a good reflection on the ability of the franchise to deliver the beautiful visuals that it would come to be known by. It was a long sequence as well. 60 seconds of pure CGI in 1982 is a big ask, and it's of a quality that had never been attempted before, but perhaps this is an example of the guys starting to run before they could walk. However, model work in The Wrath of Khan does elevate the film, and the entire sequence in the Matara Nebula is a classic example of why real studio models were used right up until Star Trek Voyager. They may have been more cumbersome, but they delivered a beautiful, punchy shot. Number 9, Star Trek Voyager in the flesh. Species 8472, aka Bad Boys of the Universe, were the largest scale entirely digital race that were created for Star Trek Voyager, and so singling them out may come across as slightly harsh. However, this particular scene lands on the list because it's such a disappointing entry to Species 8472's canon. The Doctor administers a treatment that will reverse some DNA sequencing to reveal an alien in place of a Starfleet officer. Both the Doctor and Janeway show shock and fear. However, the thing they fear is neither shocking nor frightening. For their first appearance in the show, Species 8472 was shrouded mostly in darkness. So when we see this full CGI scene, we are supposed to be treated to something very special. However, the digital creature superimposed in this sickbay set with two defined actors serving to highlight the soft CGI edge in the foreground, I mean, humans and CGI at this time just didn't work, and with the limitations of television budgeting available, it's entirely forgivable to attempt this, as the alternative option would be a guy in a suit. And in a few moments, I'll let you know why that is not a good idea. Number 8, Star Trek: The Final Frontier. Overall effects. The Final Frontier has its problems. It was beset with production issues from the off, not least because of the rush production schedule and However, for the purpose of this list, its biggest drawback was the fact that Industrial Light and Magic, the people I gave great praise for at the top of this list, who had provided effects on all 3 previous films, were working hard on Indiana Jones: The Last Crusade. This meant they were unavailable to cover the effects in this movie, and it really shows. Plus, Shatner insisted on seeing all of the pre-visuals for the effects, adding large amounts of time to change anything he didn't like, which meant less time to polish the look of the final effects. The ending sequence was originally planned to feature fire-breathing rockmen, and was replaced with a blob of light that would chase Kirk, and good thing they did, because the results of an actor in a suit made of fake rocks looked as ridiculous as it sounds. However, one massive positive the film has, while nothing to do with the effects, was the glorious return of Jerry Goldsmith to score the film, bringing back the Star Trek march from the motion picture. Redeeming. Number 7, Star Trek Voyager: Macrocosm. The macrovirus encountered by Voyager had to be the potential to be a terrifying enemy to defeat. Instead, the soft focus, balloony looking creatures just served to add to the hilarity of the overall episode. There are several issues with this season 3 entry. I mean, how did Voyager get to access those new phaser rifles? Whilst the idea of Janeway taking on a Ripley role itself would make for a great episode of Star Trek, the fact is she's fighting creatures that look like this. And this. And that. They completely deflate any sense of menace or drama from the scenario. And what's even more frustrating about these characters is that Star Trek Voyager had already shown some fairly impressive CGI work at the time. I mean, their whole ship was CGI. Many scenes in the first season stand out. The entire Grendel sequence from Heroes and Demons, for example, are also far superior. So whilst these creatures are not as bad as some of the other entries on this list, they do stand out as an awkward page in Voyager's history, an ill-conceived idea from the beginning. The entire scenario is best forgotten. Number 6, Star Trek Enterprise Stigma. This is an example of scenery which is often far easier to render than close-up shots of alien races. This is also an example of a mistake. This cityscape appeared in the Star Trek universe after the beautiful display of the cityscape of Romulus for Star Trek Nemesis. There's little argument to be had here. The people in this shot are so clearly of Sims quality that it's a wonder why they were even introduced to begin with. These are faraway shots and technically they should be better than the up-close issues that we had with some of the Xindi that we'll talk about in a moment, or the macroviruses from Voyager. But what seems to be on display is a rush job, put into a scene with the hope of revisiting it at a later stage, but instead they just said, you know what? Leave it in, no one will notice. We noticed. Cutting this shot from the episode will probably improve the whole scene as a whole. Number 5, Insurrection, Admiral Dougherty's death. Now, this entry appears here not just for the obvious visual issue on display, but also for the fact that this film should have delivered way more. Following on the heels of the fantastic Star Trek First Contact, Insurrection was a hotly anticipated sequel. The tone opted for a more upbeat and hopeful message, which was a bit jarring after the pitch blackness of the Borg plot. That aside, it is the first film in the franchise to rely entirely on CGI, and it is largely successful in delivering. The shots of the Enterprise E are beautiful, bellissimo, and the Sonar's fleet is terrifically rendered. The first CGI flaws, however, start to show in the shuttle battle between Data, Worf, and Picard. But these are forgivable. The Sonar's skin-stretching technology is less forgivable. When demonstrated on F. Murray Abrahams' Ra'afo, the makeup in place takes some of the edge off the CGI. The mask he wears is already stretched and twisted and pulled apart, so some CGI help doesn't make much of an impact. However, when the full intact face of Anthony Zerbe's Admiral Dougherty is thrown down onto the machine, the issues explode in your face. I mean, it's a roughly 5-second long scene and it robs any of the dramatic impact. Why? Well, the old man has just received a beating, which was uncomfortable to watch. I mean, the horror of his impending murder is looming. It's good enough. And then, to deflate everything, his face is stretched like putty. It's an unfortunate end to what should have been a tense and upsetting scene. Instead, we just got to watch somebody get photoshopped to death. Number 4, Star Trek Voyager Basics. Suffering many of the same issues that other Voyager entries on this list faced, the Hanonian Landiel was meant to be a terrifying creature of dread. It had the honour of being the first entirely CGI created creature for Star Trek Voyager, and whilst this was ambitious, it's also a victim of this ambition. I'll show you why. The first shot of the eel shown in this image has it wrapped up and waiting, and it looks like it's a matte painting until it moves. Another example of CGI clashing horribly with these actors in the scene. There is something positive to be said about this though, and that is these initial attempts pushed CGI artists further and further, allowing for greater displays of imagery in later seasons. I mean, this would be the precursor to the other non-humanoid creatures like the macrovirus and species 8472. But without this rubbery, poorly put together eel, Star Trek may not have had the bravery to push forward into the CGI achievements it would later display. Number 3, Star Trek Enterprise, the Xindi Aquatic. Enterprise Season 3 pushed the boundaries with its CGI, and it is responsible for the rise in the show's overall quality. The inclusion of 5 separate races of Xindis was a fantastic idea, demonstrating the differences in evolution of a race in ways that couldn't have been touched on before. The primates, the reptilian, and the arboreal races all look excellent, and makeup for each of these have varying layers and intensity, and they're a triumph. But the latter 2 races, however, while certainly ambitious, let the side down for everyone. The Xindi Aquatic race, exactly what it sounds like, is a water-dwelling element of the Xindi Council. There is very little to say other than that they look so out of place among most of the rest of the characters that it begs the question why the production team had to include them. Now, this criticism does not extend to their ships because they look pretty cool, but them themselves, ain't looking too sexy. They are perhaps let down most by the now common theme of having to interact with real actors in scenes. I told ya, CGIs and humans in the noughties just didn't work. They hadn't advanced far enough to make it look convincing, and these guys just came off as projected cartoons on the other side of a piece of glass. However, they are only the second worst of the Xindi races. Number 2, Star Trek Enterprise, the Xindi Insectoid. The Xindi Insectoid race were billed as fearsome, hot-headed and scary. But when it came to it, they weren't really that threatening. They inevitably call to the mind the similar woeful Genosians from Star Trek Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. They are, like the Aquatics, entirely rendered through CGI, but the budget really does show whenever they are on the screen. They are shown most often alongside the reptilian race, and it only serves to do an injustice to them both. The reptilians are supposed to be fearsome and deadly too, which they are most certainly are. I mean, when they're alone, thanks to a combination of acting and fantastic makeup, they're convincing, but there is no strong acting to reconcile the dreadful CGI displays for the Xindi Insectoids here. Showing them in the room with the rest and having other actors react to them so seriously is sometimes, unintentionally, hilarious. Like I said, if there's a positive to take from this, it's the fact that the limitations that were shown here gave rise to the need for greater budgets and more technology when it came to attempting things like this. Number 1, Star Trek Enterprise The Gorn. I mean, this is a winner. The absolute winner of worst CGI has to go to the Gorn, the very same creature that will probably win any list for worst makeup and costuming as well. Now, the final season of Enterprise has many of the best episodes on the show. 2 such episodes are the 2-parter In a Mirror Darkly. They are set entirely in the Mirror universe, and they are a lot of fun watching the crew play out evil versions of themselves, along with boarding a 60s accurate version of the USS Defiant. I mean, there's even a Tholin in the episode, which looks pretty good all things considered. You simply just have to see the funny side. I mean, I've said it a few times in this list, but let me spell it out to you. Humans and CGI at this time just did not mix. Well, not in this case anyway. I don't even want to think about how Scott Bakula felt rolling around on the floor with, well, was it nothing? Was it another actor? I mean, I'll go as far as to say I preferred the one that Kirk fought in the original series, Arena. Some people say that they think this poor quality was an intentional and tongue-in-cheek move from the Enterprise crew, and if you look at it like that, then I guess it completely adds to the hilarity of the episode. Maybe one day the Gorn will appear in either Discovery or Picard, where they might be represented as a more formidable race, or they might just have somebody in a rubber suit. Who knows? Thanks to this wonderful CGI offering, they remain the funniest and cuddliest warrior race in the Star Trek canon.
Some people would give their left arm to appear on Star Trek, and some other people feel like it cost them the equivalent of it. There has been 60 years of Star Trek history, and in that time, hundreds of actors have passed through the final frontier. It stands to reason that not all of them would have had an amazing time. Many have spoken openly about how much of their time on the show affected them and their careers. Some have had such a bad time that they have refused to work with the franchise ever again. So, without further ado, I'm Marcus Bronzy from TrekCulture, and here are 12 actors who hated being on Star Trek. Number 12. Denise Crosby. Lieutenant Tasha Yar was a key character of the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation. She was tough, brave, and strong, filling the role of a security chief aboard a Galaxy-class starship. It looked to be a juicy role to sink an actor's teeth into, and Denise Crosby was brought in to play the part. However, she quickly became frustrated with the way her character was being used, or should I say, underused. She has commented in recent times that she felt that if a matte painting of her legs had been done, it could have been slotted behind the command chairs underneath the security station. That was the impact she felt her character was having based on the stories she was being given. Now, whilst I wouldn't complain about having my knees behind Sir Patrick Stewart during some of his glory years in The Next Generation, there's no getting around that line, is there? Moving on. I can understand her frustration. In what Sir Patrick Stewart has since described as a big mistake, the show failed to keep Crosby on board and she quit before the end of the season. Her character was written out by being killed by Armus, the black slime embodiment of evil. It was both a shocking and underwhelming end to a character with a lot of potential. She was, however, brought back for one episode in the third season's great Yesterday's Enterprise, where we see her in an alternate timeline. Fan reaction was such that Crosby then pitched the idea of Yar having a half-Romulan daughter, Sela, and this daughter would go on to appear in 3 more stories. However, her first year was somewhat wasted in what could have been some real ground-laying work. Number 11. Jeffrey Dean Morgan. Before Lucille and he went off to do some zombie hunting in The Walking Dead, Negan was a Star Trek Enterprise character. However, thanks to the show, he almost quit acting altogether. Jeffrey Dean Morgan appeared in the 3rd season of Enterprise in the episode entitled Carpenter Street alongside guest star Leyland Orser. Now, the heavy makeup required for the Xindi reptilian role was overbearing and claustrophobic, which meant that filming was a miserable experience for him. Morgan later admitted that there were times he would cry in the evenings from frustration, fatigue, and bitterness. Once production was wrapped on the episode, he had decided that acting wasn't for him. However, thankfully, he would take time and change his mind, eventually becoming the successful Negan on The Walking Dead. Number 10. Diana Muldaur. Diana Muldaur has actually appeared as 3 separate Star Trek characters in the franchise. She began her career in Trek on the original series, appearing in the episode Return to Tomorrow. She would later return as a different character in Truth, Is There No Beauty? She described the experience working with the original series crew as enjoyable, feeling a sense of camaraderie. So, coming back to join the crew of the Enterprise would have been a cinch for the next generation. Well, you are wrong. Things were not so smooth when she returned once more, this time as Dr. Catherine Pulaski in the Next Generation's 2nd season. She was brought in as a replacement for Gates McFadden, who had been fired at the end of the 1st season by producer Maurice Hurley. Hurley had strongly objected to McFadden's attempts to beef up her character. This meant Muldaur was walking into a situation where she was replacing a beloved colleague who had been lost in dubious circumstances. It has often been said that the crew of TNG were extremely close for the duration of the show. However, it seems that Muldaur never warmed to the group, nor they her, during her tenure. She basically wasn't feeling the love. On top of that, she was always billed as a special guest star, which doesn't really make you feel part of the family. And once the season ended, she declined to return for the 3rd season. Number 9. Robert Beltran. Robert Beltran was one of the actors who started to voice his criticisms of the show long before it came to an end. He was originally 2nd lead in Star Trek Voyager, a role that had been enjoyed by Leonard Nimoy and Jonathan Frakes. However, he never had the same experience that they had. In his opinion, this was due to the fact that the producers simply forgot about his character after a while. He had been brought in as the leader of a separate group within Voyager crew, but the marquee subplot fizzled out as the show progressed. He was further irked by the introduction of 7 of 9. He felt that the show was beginning to aim for a lower denominator of fan base, using sex appeal rather than strong storytelling. I wonder if he felt the same way after they shared a few on-screen kisses. He felt that Chakotay, along with Tuvok, Tom Paris and Harry Kim, were quickly given less and less to do as the show began to further explain 7's storylines. Once the final season rolled around, he allegedly gave the most wooden performance as possible, as he felt if the show wasn't going to offer him any meaty roles or things to do, well, they didn't deserve his finest work. He was critical of the season finale, quoted as saying, "This is it," once he discovered the ending. And to be fair, I did think the ending was quite abrupt. Anyway, he has softened his views in recent years, but it's safe to say that he was no fan of the show by the time it wrapped. Number 8. Grace Lee Whitney. Grace Lee Whitney was one of the sadder stories when it came to the Trek alumni. She was an actress and singer before being cast in Star Trek, and she appeared in 8 episodes of the 1st season of the original series, playing Yeoman Rand, Kirk's personal assistant. However, she was then released from her contract and then went on to claim that she had been sexually assaulted by a producer and that Leonard Nimoy had been of great support to her at the time. She returned to the franchise for the motion picture after her former colleague DeForest Kelly found out she was unemployed. She appeared in 4 of the movies, 2 internet episodes, and returned for the 30th anniversary special Flashback with George Takei. She also managed to capitalize on her Trek fame by releasing Trek-themed music. She died in May 2015, just months after her dear friend Leonard Nimoy. Number 7. Malcolm McDowell. Dr. Sauron is one of the most hated characters in Star Trek history. He killed Captain Kirk, damn it! Sorry about that, sorry. However, the actor playing him, Malcolm McDowell, liked him about as much as the rest of the fandom. McDowell had long been known to his audience for his performances in films like the iconic Clockwork Orange, but this was the first and to date his only foray into Star Trek. He appeared in Star Trek Generations as a scientist trying to get back to the Nexus, willing to destroy anything in his path to do it. While he plays the character with an endearing subtlety and a quiet rage, McDowell felt the script let him down. In fact, he was quoted by his nephew Alexander Siddig, aka Julian Bashir, as saying that he thought the script was weak, and he himself admitted that he only took the role for the money. Word on the bridge is he turned it down 4 times until the producers agreed to his asking price. McDowell also received death threats from irate fans after the film was released, as they were really unhappy with his character's actions. Perhaps for his own safety, he's avoided returning to the Trek universe ever since. Number 6. Susanna Thompson. Susanna Thompson played several characters during her tenure on Star Trek, appearing in The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, where she was one half of the franchise's first same-sex kiss with Terry Farrell. Later, she appeared as the Borg Queen in Star Trek Voyager's Dark Frontier and Unimatrix Zero. It was the makeup and costuming that Thompson particularly struggled with for these instances. For her first appearance, she was given contact lenses that were so uncomfortable that she thought of quitting outright after the first day of filming. She was in tremendous pain, and coupled with long hours, she felt that she wouldn't be able to do it again. However, she did, and completed filming on Dark Frontier. She also agreed to return for the 2-part Unimatrix Zero, but on the condition that she was given new and better contacts, and that she could take them out more often than she had been allowed while filming Dark Frontier. She was not available for the series finale, and Alice Krieger was brought in to reprise the role she had originated in Star Trek First Contact. Number 5. Leonard Nimoy. Leonard Nimoy initially had quite a complex relationship with Star Trek. He was cast in the original pilot as the alien character with pointy eyebrows and ears, and his appearance brought criticism from conservative viewers as he was deemed to be satanic. But now, it's fair to say that without Spock or Vulcans, Star Trek would look very different. However, it was exactly his appearance that would become the issue. Nimoy discovered that after the original series wrapped, that his likeness was being used in advertising without his consent, and more importantly at the time, without receiving any royalties. He would grow weary of the constant association with Spock, going so far as to write an autobiography entitled I Am Not Spock. In 1979, as the production was gearing up on the first motion picture, Jeffrey Katzenberg had to beg him to return. Whilst the motion picture was a huge financial success, it wasn't a critical darling, and Nimoy only agreed to return for the Wrath of Khan on the provision that he be killed off. Well, he certainly received his wish. Before production wrapped on the Wrath of Khan, he approached the studio and asked to be brought back for the sequel. He also asked to direct, which cemented his return to the franchise. Before his death, Nimoy published another autobiography entitled I Am Spock, proving his frustrations with the series were thankfully temporary. Number 4. Jeri Ryan. While the franchise is currently enjoying the glorious return of 7 of 9 in Picard, her first stint on the show was not a pleasant one. She was brought in at the beginning of Star Trek Voyager's 4th season in an open attempt to boost flagging ratings, replacing Jennifer Ann Lean's Kez, who producers felt wasn't hitting the right notes with the audience. The cast initially struggled to warm to her, and she has been quoted on several occasions speaking about how another actor made her life quite difficult on set. That actor was Kate Mulgrew. She'd been hired as Star Trek's first leading female captain, and she felt the progressive moves of the producers began to fall by the wayside once the character of Seven appeared. Now, she's been open about her coldness to Jeri Ryan on set, making their scenes together, many of which are really tender, all the more resonant when one takes into account the tensions behind them. Number 3. Wil Wheaton. Wil Wheaton was coming off an already successful career when he appeared in Star Trek The Next Generation as Wesley Crusher. He had just starred in the critical hit Stand By Me and was fresh in people's minds. He was brought into the show to play the character that, unfortunately, many audiences would quickly come to hate. One such audience member was Rod Roddenberry, Gene's son. he felt anger towards Will, as he felt that Gene was replacing the missing relationship between father and son with the relationship he was establishing with Will. As the show began to air, Wheaton became the subject of much negative fan reaction and would eventually leave in the show's 4th season. In a recent reunion, Wheaton spoke about his feelings of regret for the way he handled his time on the show. He felt sad and ashamed of the way that he had left, and he felt that for years he was not able to keep up a relationship with his castmates. Thankfully, in later life, he has been welcomed back to the family, returning for 2002's Star Trek Nemesis and currently hosting the after show for Star Trek Picard, The Ready Room. Number 2, Brent Spiner. Another actor who has stepped back into the franchise is old Yellow Eyes. He was quite infamously killed off at the end of Star Trek Nemesis. This was actually a stipulation of Spiner's, as after almost 20 years, he was ready to walk away from the show. To be clear, not all of his time in Star Trek was a negative experience. He remains very close to the cast and frequents fan conventions. The role of Data typecasted him for a long time, and despite starring roles in films like Independence Day, which was one of the biggest films in the 90s, he's often expressed dislike at the questions he is asked by reporters and fans about his time on Star Trek, especially saying that they lack in diversity. However, as time has gone on and enough distance has grown between him and the everyday aspect of the role, he seems to be happier to look back fondly on his time. And though he may forever be Data in many people's eyes, he seems to have quietly put his feelings behind him and embraced the franchise once more with his appearance on Picard. Number 1. Garrett Wang. To date, Garrett Wang is the only cast member to have had a request to direct an episode refused by the producers. Many of the Star Trek alumni and current cast have taken the director's chair, along with Shatner, Nimoy, Frakes and Burton, Stewart and Brooks even. All of them have directed episodes or features of the franchise. So when Garrett Wang put in a request, his denial must have been a bit of a slap in the face. The fact it was denied seems to be emblematic of the larger issue of the Star Trek Voyager series. In the 7-year run of the show, it suffered from ratings issues. Characters were also being underwritten and undeveloped. Perhaps the worst victim of this was Wang. A common joke is that Harry Kim was the franchise forever ensign, unable to gain a promotion, even though he had more experience than half of Starfleet. This is even remarked on in several episodes. However, Wang says that he did ask for his character to be promoted, and the response was, well, someone has to be ensign. Couple this with the refusal of the directing gig and the lack of cast cohesion, there's little mystery as to why Garrett Wang did not have the most enjoyable time on Star Trek. Like many others on this list, he still attends the conventions and seems more than happy to be a part of the show regardless.
Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, was very passionate about the franchise throughout his life. He constantly advocated for Trek to portray an earnest and optimistic future for humanity, one that mirrored his own hopes for a better tomorrow. While most of the time the writers and other creative people working on Trek tried their best to follow Gene's utopian vision, there were times where it was simply just too restrictive to the story. Gene wanted to have no main characters fighting with each other, no storylines involving technology being used as a villain, no reoccurring aliens or themes, and plenty of other things that, if followed, would have honestly ruined Star Trek. Of course, Gene's optimism is still respected by creators of Trek today, but in a way that's much more realistic than Gene originally intended. Some fans criticize modern Trek for not following Gene's guidelines as precisely as the original series or The Next Generation, but it should be said that some of the greatest moments in Trek history were strongly opposed by Mr. Roddenberry. With all that being said, I'm Bree from TrekCulture, and here are 10 times that Gene Roddenberry hated Star Trek. Number 10. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. It may come as a surprise to many Trek fans that one of the most beloved movies in the franchise, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, was actually disliked by Roddenberry for many reasons. Although the motion picture made money, it was received poorly by critics and general audiences, most people finding it a bit too boring and pretentious. Some even going as far as to dub it the motionless picture. It became clear to the studio that in order to reinvigorate Star Trek, they would need to go in a radically different direction for the next film. They took a lot lot of Gene's creative control away, instead letting Harve Bennett take the lead for the new script. Roddenberry was, of course, upset with having his control taken away, though his biggest issue with the film was the supposed militarization of Starfleet. He hated the violence in the film and thought that the Genesis device was a ridiculous idea. Whether or not he was right, today, The Wrath of Khan is regarded as one of Trek's best stories. The introduction of a strong villain, a classic from the original series no less, showed that Trek can be exciting and fun while still staying smart. Number 9. Family. The Next Generation episode Family directly follows the Best of Both Worlds, the iconic two-parter episode where Captain Picard got assimilated by the Borg and turned into Locutus, destroying countless Starfleet ships at the Battle of Warp 359 before finally having his humanity restored at the end of the episode. In Family, Picard returns to Earth with the Enterprise to visit his family and recover from the trauma of being assimilated. Roddenberry was strongly against this script, wanting instead to keep the story self-contained in each episode. Apparently, Gene would rather have Picard go right back to boldly going, mere days after having the very essence of his individuality taken from him and being forced to kill thousands. However, his main criticism for the script was the way that Picard's upbringing was portrayed and the hostility between him and his brother. He argued that siblings would simply not argue and fight like that in the 24th century, which anyone who has siblings I'm pretty sure would disagree with. Family would eventually be recognized as one of the most emotional storylines for Picard, giving his character more depth. It also helps audiences recover after the Best of Both Worlds and makes it a little more believable for Picard to return to work in the next episode. Number 8. The original series crossover on The Next Generation. Strangely, Gene Roddenberry didn't want any classic characters from the original series to return in The Next Generation. His reason for this, as stated in the official Star Trek Bible he wrote, is that he wanted the newest Star Trek show to stand apart from the original as something new and different. This was a noble goal. Roddenberry was committed to not letting the franchise go stale, constantly evolving it to be grander and more modern. This is something that shows like Discovery, Lower Decks, and Picard are continuing to this day. However, every now and then, a cameo from another series in the franchise can be fun to see. It helps the universe feel truly connected and real. Roddenberry was originally very adamant against crossovers, but caved and allowed for DeForest Kelley to make an appearance as Dr. McCoy in the Next Generation pilot to tour the Enterprise D. Eventually, Star Trek became more comfortable with crossovers, and during Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and other following shows, became a deeply connected universe. Number 7. Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. Nowadays, there have been so many ships called Enterprise in Star Trek that it's hard to keep track. But this wasn't always going to be the case. Gene Roddenberry had a strong emotional connection to the original Enterprise and was heartbroken when it was destroyed in Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. Harve Bennett, another main creative head on Star Trek at the time, knew audiences would appreciate the shock ending of having the Enterprise self-destruct to save the day. Roddenberry, however, believed the destruction of the Enterprise was symbolic of Bennett trying to take creative control over Star Trek and change it to fit his own vision. Roddenberry eventually caved in when it was decided a new Enterprise, the Enterprise A, would be constructed to replace the original. Previously, the plan was to do away with the name Enterprise forever and have the Excelsior be the main hero ship of the franchise. Number 6. The removal of Number 1. The pilot episode of Star Trek the original series, The Cage, featured an entirely different cast apart from Spock. Among them, playing the First Officer Number 1 was Majel Barrett, the partner and future wife of Gene Roddenberry. Gene wanted to give Barrett a lead role in Star Trek, but when the studio watched The Cage, although they were intrigued by the premise of the show, they hated the cast, particularly two of the lead characters, Spock and Number 1. Gene eventually convinced them to keep Spock, but all other characters had to be replaced. Barrett lost the role of First Officer, but appeared in future episodes of the original series wearing a blonde wig, playing Nurse Chapel. Eventually, during The Next Generation, Barrett went on to voice a number of computers on the show, as well as the fan-favorite character Loxana Troi. And of course, we also have Strange New Worlds, the show based around the adventures of the original crew from The Cage, including Number 1, now portrayed by Rebecca Romaine. So, although Gene was annoyed by Barrett's exclusion, she eventually got to solidify her place in Trek in other ways. And her character Number 1 is finally getting the spotlight in Strange New Worlds. Number 5. Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. Star Trek V: The Final Frontier is regarded by many fans as the worst movie in the franchise, but one of its most vocal haters was Gene Roddenberry himself. Gene even prepared to take legal action against William Shatner, the director of the film, for abusing his creation and slapping the name Gene Roddenberry on it. The case never materialized, but it did cause a lot of drama behind the scenes. Shatner and Roddenberry didn't talk much, if at all, during the production of the movie. But when Roddenberry learned about the plot, he became irritated, believing that Shatner was ripping off an old movie he was working on but never finished, called The God Thing. The script had somewhat similar religious themes as The Final Frontier, and Roddenberry was under the impression that Shatner was stealing the story that he desperately wanted to tell. Number 4. Redemption. The Next Generation Season 4 finale, Redemption, was the 100th episode made for the series, and as such, Roddenberry wanted it to be big. Redemption continued the Klingon political arc that began earlier in the series. In the episode, we saw a civil war beginning to brew in the Klingon Empire. The conflict was resolved by the end of the episode, but Roddenberry was still upset that the 100th episode of The Next Generation featured a war plot, something he considered too bleak for the show. Ronald D. Moore was responsible for pushing Redemption into production, despite Gene's wishes, and most fans are glad he did. Moore was responsible for creating most of the updated Klingon aesthetics and had a real talent for creating believable alien cultures. Redemption is just one example of Moore taking the Klingons and fleshing them out to be more believable. Beyond his typical hatred for violence, Roddenberry also didn't believe that Worf was strong enough of a character to carry the 100th episode. Fortunately, Redemption and a few more episodes, especially in Deep Space Nine, eventually turned Worf into a pretty good lead character. Number 3. Episodes where technology is the enemy. While outlining the rules for Star Trek The Next Generation in his official series Bible, Gene Roddenberry was very clear that he wanted the writers to avoid portraying technology in a negative way. Roddenberry was very aware that many people loved Star Trek because it takes place in an optimistic future, one where technology is humanity's salvation rather than the cause of its demise, as in the case with most other science fiction. Replicators, transporters, and warp drive turned Earth into a paradise where all people are free to explore the universe and pursue their passions. However, this advice has been blatantly ignored in The Next Generation many times. The Borg, for example, are a technological nightmare that serves as a warning for anyone looking to integrate computers with people's minds. Or, what about the constant transporter and hologram malfunctions? All technology has a good and bad side. Gene Roddenberry was an optimist who couldn't imagine why someone would use a replicator to create a gun rather than a cheeseburger, but eventually, the writers abandoned this guideline altogether, not in fear of new technology, but in acceptance of its destructive possibilities. Number 2. The disappearance of Wesley Crusher. Wesley Crusher was one of Gene Roddenberry's favorite characters in Star Trek, mostly because the character was actually based on an idealized version of himself as a teenager. The audience's reaction to Wesley deeply upset Gene. At times, due to Wesley being based off of himself, he even saw their hate for the character as an attack on him. The truth is that most people disliked Wesley simply because he was too perfect. During Season 1 of The Next Generation, Wesley was the star of the show, constantly saving the ship and beating impossible odds, and never once making a mistake. As the series progressed, Wesley appeared less and less before leaving the ship to attend Starfleet Academy, then ditched the Federation altogether in the episode Journey's End to explore space and reality with the Traveler, his mysterious alien mentor. He isn't seen after this point until the movie Star Trek Nemesis, where he's just sitting in the background during the wedding scene. Gene Roddenberry was also annoyed that his self-inserted character was sidelined, especially because it wasn't the studio that rejected him, but the fans. Number 1. The Animated Series. Star Trek the Animated Series was basically created to keep the love of Star Trek alive in the zeitgeist long enough for movies to be made. The show's actually quite good. The storylines are very reminiscent of the original series, though sometimes even grander, as the animation format allows the writers to tell any story they want regardless of budget constraints. Gene Roddenberry, however, disagreed. He famously hated the show because of a few minor story errors, but these errors were nothing worse than what was seen on the original series. In fact, the Next Generation ships are way slower than Kirk's Enterprise, for example. Despite this, when Roddenberry's office reobtained the creative license for Star Trek at the end of The Next Generation's first season, he officially made the animated series non-canon. According to Gene, it never happened. Nowadays, matters are a little more complicated. We've seen references to the animated series in Deep Space Nine, Lower Decks, and other Trek installments, and it seems like it's making a return to canon once and for all. As David Gerrold, a writer for the animated series, put it, arguments about canon are silly. I always felt that Star Trek Animated was part of Star Trek because Gene Roddenberry accepted the paycheck for it and put his name in the credits.
Because Star Trek's characters are beloved by so many people, some of the actors have gotten very attached to who they play on the show, and rightly so. But often actors' visions for their characters have been overshadowed by the vision of the writers and the studio executives. This has actually caused a lot of drama behind the scenes that audiences aren't typically aware of. A number of issues like plot lines that come out of nowhere and alien concepts that make no logical sense could have been avoided if the people in charge had been more open to feedback from the cast. Others simply suffered from bad writing and a lack of character development. Whatever their reasons, here are 8 scenes from Star Trek that the actors absolutely hated shooting. Number 8. The first appearance of the Ferengi. Many fans don't know this, but one of the first Ferengi ever seen on Star Trek in the Next Generation episode The Last Outpost was actually played by Armin Shimmerman, the actor who went on to play Quark in Deep Space Nine. Unfortunately for Shimmerman, this performance went on to haunt him. As he explained to GameSpot at the time, the Ferengi were not yet fully developed into the species we know today. During the early episodes of The Next Generation, they were originally intended to be more menacing, scary, and actual enemies of the Federation. But Shimmerman played up to the evil factor perhaps a bit too much, and as a result, ended up portraying the Ferengi as incredibly one-dimensional and a bit silly during his first appearance. When Deep Space Nine began and the studio was looking for someone to play their new recurring Ferengi character, Quark, Shimmerman auditioned 3 times before getting the role. And even though we eventually got to see more of the Ferengi and their culture throughout Deep Space Nine, it's fair to say that he set the tone. Number 7. Dr. Bashir's secret being revealed. In the episode Dr. Bashir, I presume, from Season 5 of Deep Space Nine, it was revealed that Dr. Julian Bashir was genetically modified by his parents when he was about 7 years old to have superior physical and mental abilities. We learned that Bashir struggled with learning at a young age, quickly falling behind all of his peers at school. So his parents gave him illegal genetic enhancements. Could do with some of those, hoping to give him a chance at a brighter future, but had to keep it a secret, as genetic manipulation was banned in the Federation. It was a big surprise, and many fans saw it as fun and interesting. A new direction for Bashir's character even, because prior to this, audiences had criticised him for being an annoying know-it-all, always hitting on Dax, and I think learning this secret about him made him seem a little bit more human, and all of his behaviour a little bit more justified maybe. However, Alexander Siddig, who played the Doctor, disagreed. Siddig only learned of Bashir's secret mere days before filming began on the episode, and he was devastated that the writers would include such an important reveal for his character without even consulting him once. To get back at the execs, he said he purposefully put minimal effort into the recording of the episode and protested for Bashir's genetic modifications to be largely ignored afterwards, though they do occasionally come into play in the later series. Number 6. Jadzia's death scene. When Star Trek Deep Space Nine neared the end of its 6th season and the show was coming to a close, Terry Farrell, who played Jadzia Dax on nearly every episode thus far, requested to have her appearance made less frequent on the show so she could have time to pursue other roles. Unsurprisingly, the producers denied this request and gave Farrell only 2 options. Jadzia remains as a lead character, or she gets killed off. Farrell chose the latter, which resulted in an RKO-style death scene where Jadzia is killed by the Par-Wraith-possessed Gul Dukat in the episode Tears of the Prophets. Admittedly, this was a shocking surprise and led to many interesting stories with Dax's new host Ezri, which I found progressive in some ways, but Terry Farrell was disappointed that her character had to die so abruptly. It's likely that the writers had already thought about Dax having a symbiote move to a new host, as throughout the whole series we've been learning about her past lives and we always knew that one day she would transfer to somebody else. Number 5. Chakotay and Seven of Nine's romance. During Season 7 of Star Trek Voyager, Seven of Nine really made progress on regaining her humanity. As the series came to a close, Seven began forming strong friendships and even experimenting with romance on the holodeck in that episode called Human Error. This episode, and the one that followed, Natural Law, started toying with the idea of Seven and Chakotay developing feelings for each other. But when Jerry Ryan, who played Seven of Nine, asked the producers if they were going to include a romance between the 2 characters, they responded, absolutely not. So of course, it annoyed Ryan when she was surprised by a sudden random scene that was included at the beginning of Voyager's finale, Endgame, in which Seven and Chakotay were seen to be dating out of the blue, presumably madly in love with each other. Ryan was told specifically not to play into the romance between her character and Robert Beltran, but the producers still went ahead and included it. Likely they were just trying to add some tactless conclusion to Seven's story. Luckily though, in the first season of Picard, we get to see a more human version of Seven without her need of a forced romance to prove it. Number 4, the dance from Move Along Home. Deep Space Nine, like most other Trek shows, started off with a rather lackluster first season. But you know, things get going after a little while. However, no episode fully encapsulates the show's early failings as much as Move Along Home. In the episode, an alien delegation from the Gamma Quadrant visited the station and brought aboard this mysterious game which they eventually convinced Quark to play. Quark didn't realise, however, that Sisko, Dax, Bashir and Kira were kidnapped from the station and put into this simulation game. They were also controlled by his choices in the game. Eventually, he learned that they were taken and saw that failure in the game could lead to their deaths. This was a really cool idea for a story and definitely one of the most unique episodes of season 1, but it was executed in a way that was just weird. In 2013, Avery Brooks said that he particularly disliked the weird alien dance he and the others were forced to do inside the game, all whilst hopping around and singing that ridiculous song, "A la mare, count to 4, a 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 la mare." And I've remixed it, haven't I? I've made it into an Afrobeat song, but a la mare, count to 4. Number 3, Dr. Crusher's weird ghost romance. Gates McFadden, who played Dr. Crusher, hated the Next Generation episode Sub Rosa, and, well, most people found it peculiar, at least. This episode was so ridiculous. I mean, she f***s a ghost. Wait, you know what? I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's roll this back a bit. Dr. Crusher gets a family heirloom from her recently deceased grandmother. The small candlelight device then activates when she's alone and releases an alien entity known as Ronin, who Crusher, well, she f***s him. She does. I mean, she has romantic relations with him, if you want to put it in a better sense of words, but the scenes portraying their intimacy were hilariously overacted by McFadden, who, of course, realised how profoundly absurd the plot was for this episode. It gets even worse. Later in the episode, her grandmother's dead body is possessed by Ronin, and we learn that this same alien entity has been seducing people in her family for generations. The scenes between Crusher and Ronin are awkward, hilarious, and painful to watch, and McFadden has talked often in the past about how laughable she found them at the time. Number 2, the holodeck scenes in Star Trek Enterprise finale. When Star Trek Enterprise was cancelled in 2005, the cast as well as the audiences hoped that the show would at least get a good conclusion for some of the main plot lines that were set up over the series. By the last series, we had things going on like the Temporal Cold War, the Xindi War, and all of the side stories, and they all had to hastily be completed. A few of my Trek mates would say that the early cancellation of a show is what prevented it from ever really taking off as much as other Star Trek installments over the years. If they were given more time, the plot lines could have been resolved more elegantly. The final episode made things even worse, particularly with the prevalence of Jonathan Frakes, who returns as our good old chair-hopping Riker, watching a historical holodeck program about the end of Archer's journey with the first Enterprise. It's good to see Riker, Troy and the old Enterprise D again, but having Riker interject with commentary or just stare at the Enterprise characters as they go through some of the most emotional moments for them in the series was presumably seen as insulting by Bakula, who never voiced his concern, but according to Brannon Braga, was very displeased by the finale. Frakes has gone on to say that he believes his presence in the finale took away from the main cast moment. Number 1, Captain Kirk's death scene. One scene that most fans will find hard to watch for one reason or another is Captain Kirk's death scene in Star Trek Generations. James T. Kirk is one of the most renowned Starfleet officers in history, both in lore and in the eyes of us fans. Unfortunately, through his death in the 7th Star Trek film, it was hardly the send-off that the character deserved. In Generations, Kirk was lost in a timeless dimension of pure happiness known as the Nexus, and is pulled back into reality by Picard and killed by falling to his death by fighting Tolian Soren, a man who Kirk has never met and has no history with. Not to mention, Picard could have re-emerged from the Nexus at any point in time, even days before the battle with Saran, which made Kirk's death seem completely avoidable. It shouldn't surprise anyone to learn that William Shatner was also not happy with his character's unceremonious death. Shatner explained to TrekMovie.com that the only reason he agreed to perform this scene was because the creative leads told him the only options were to do this scene like they wanted or to make it happen off screen. It was definitely cool to see Kirk and Picard teaming up for the first time, but Kirk's death should have been more personal to his character, not a quick torch pass to the next generation.
We're not going to see Up the Long Ladder, Shades of Grey or Extinction on this, because they're pants. With that in mind, I'm Sean Ferrick for TrekCulture, and here are 10 Star Trek episodes you love to hate. Number 10. Threshold. Tom Paris becomes a giant salamander. That's the sales pitch, and you know what? There are far worse ways for a story to go. This is another episode that has the benefit of time on its side, as when it was initially released, it was just a little too rubbish to be properly appreciated. This is Star Trek Voyager taking a risk in a completely bonkers way. Breaking the warp 10 barrier seems like it should be the primary aim of all propulsion experts in Starfleet. Therefore, seeing Paris attempt to flight isn't all that ridiculous. The fallout from this is a series of segments of the episode getting weirder and weirder as it goes, then Paris pulls out his tongue, as one does. The idea is what hurt the episode. There's going to be several lists, including ones written by this author, where the episode is panned. But is it really that bad? Okay, perhaps it is, but is it offensively bad? Not in the slightest. Robert Duncan McNeill is clearly having a ball playing this de-evolved version of humanity. The makeup effects are truly impressive, and even though the ending is highly questionable, those little salamander babies are really quite cute. No one is arguing that this is a good episode, but it is ridiculous fun all the same. Number 9, Precious Cargo. Precious Cargo is an almost straight remake of The Perfect Mate, though it's a far inferior copy. Think of it as the B4 to Mate's Data. It just isn't as good, and it's never going to be. So what's it doing on this list? Connor Trinneer and Padma Lakshmi have a strange, funny, volatile relationship in the episode that somehow makes this dreadful script work. While this hour of Star Trek is definitely a candidate for the old saying, great actors can't save a bad script, just watching the two of them play off each other helps to bring a bit of charm to proceedings. Having said that, Lakshmi, with all due respect, is not a great actor here. The weight falls mostly on Trinneer to carry the plot, and there are some moments where she becomes a little grating. Hardly her fault, the character description is be entitled, but the respect that grows between them is actually quite endearing, and by the episode's end, the audience can almost believe that they really would have come to fancy each other. The episode is awful, but it's the kind of awful that gets a little better on the rewatch. Number 8, Spock's Brain. Spock's Brain constantly turns up on lists of the worst episodes of Star Trek, and for good reason. Frankly, it's awful. It was a victim of the slashed budget that Star Trek's third season received, with a weak script to match. Leonard Nimoy went on the record to say he was embarrassed while filming the episode, and no one involved was particularly enthused about where the season would go from there. Now, having said all of that, there's now been 50 years to reclass this episode, and while it's still not about to arrive on most loved lists, it has passed into so bad it's good. Vulcans can exist for a short time without a brain. Sure, why not? McCoy's able to reattach Spock's brain while speaking to the man? Sure, why not? By this stage in Star Trek, while there hadn't been any other occurrences that were exactly the same as this, it was an extreme version of how far along the realms of fantasy that Star Trek existed. In a show that featured transporters, phasers, and replicators, then why can't these alien creatures live on for a time after a craniotomy? There is an argument to be made that Spock's Katra in Star Trek 3 is a refined version of this episode's idea. Number 7, Stardust City Rag. On initial airing, this episode wound up a lot of people the wrong way. It opens with the brutal death of a fan favourite character, then is followed up with Patrick Stewart in pantomime, before finishing with 7 of 9 becoming a cold-blooded killer. Frankly, it was many things that Star Trek had successfully avoided being in its lifetime. But is it really that bad? The actors are obviously having a ball here, though none more so than Santiago Cabrera as Riosh, bopping away like an over-the-top pimp as he stumbles around the bar. As Riosh in the normal run of things, he oscillates between grumpy and depressed, so seeing him let loose a little is extremely enjoyable to watch. The first hints of something more between Seven and Raffi are laid on the holodeck, while Michelle Hurd's performance alongside her on-screen son is heart-wrenching. The villains are wafer-thin, serving only as a blockade against the retrieval of Maddox, even if they're a little fun in their own way. Girardi's murder of Bruce is probably the main reason that this episode scores so low, as it really doesn't get a satisfying resolution. Alison Pill really does sell the scene. If nothing else, enjoy the episode for the dreadful French accent that a seemingly French Picard stumbles through on free cloud. Number 6, Sub Rosa. Remember the episode where Beverly f***ed a candle? Sure you do. Try to forget it. In fact, even Gates McFadden has called this one out for its ridiculous story, loosely based on Anne Rice's The Witching Hour. Duncan Rager guest stars as Ronan, the candle in question, and the Scottish backdrop is a valiant attempt to make an atmospheric ghost story. It's completely ridiculous, start to finish, but it's the kind of ridiculous that's fun rather than simply stupid for stupid's sake. McFadden, even though she was as confused as the rest of us, still gives it her all as the hopelessly in love Dr. Crusher falling for Ronan's charm. charms. Only Captain Picard seems to understand just how bonkers the plot is, knocking on Crusher's door and calling her out for her distinctly odd behaviour. It's an episode that has aged with charm, even if it is as silly today as it was then. It's the characters that we know and love taking a trip like a college kid on their first experience with booze. Jonathan Frakes directs with as much fake lightning as the studio would allow. Sub Rosa is unique. Number 5. Plato's Stepchildren. Plato's Stepchildren is mostly remembered for the infamous kiss between Kirk and Uhura, but there's another reason why it should never ever be forgot. This episode is insane. Truly, the writing team had obviously drunk something that was off while they were coming up with this one. The choices are simply bizarre, though they are absolutely entertaining all these years later. Captain Kirk is pretending to be a horse. Why is Captain Kirk pretending to be a horse? Captain Kirk wants to make love. Okay, maybe not the last part. That is saved strictly from mountains. Still, the actors are all pushed into the strangest positions by the Platonians. McCoy is tossed around by an invisible wind, Spock dances, Kirk slaps himself. The episode does try to put across a progressive message. Not only does it include the kiss, but it also contains the message that size, colour and species don't matter in the 23rd century. This is especially welcome news for Alexander, played by Michael Dunn, who was a dwarf. This message is slightly undone when Kirk informs Scotty that he is bringing a little surprise aboard at the episode's close. Honestly, don't go into this one looking for sense, and you'll have a good time. Number 4. Justice. A bunch of semi-naked people run around a grassy planet, and Wesley Crusher is sentenced to death. Now, it sounds like the greatest things in sliced bread, but somehow, this mix managed to deliver a ridiculous episode that even purist struggles with. It's one of the most 80s episodes of the Next Generation's run, one that is absolutely hilarious and woeful at the same time. Picard just casually ignores the Prime Directive at the episode's end, which seems to haunt him as he spends the next 6 seasons talking about its importance. Wesley never mentions again how close to death he came, which seems like it would be something that might stick in the mind. Those poor actors had to run in those spandex season 1 uniforms on a bright sunny day. Justice is nonsense made flesh, with next to no reason for existing other than to show a bunch of fit people and that cool image of the Edo's god in the sky. But at the same time, it's quintessential first season Next Gen. It's a handy episode to show someone who really wants to know exactly how bad it can get. Just watch this one with a glass of something strong and switch off the brain. Number 3. Move Along Home. Be honest, you're already singing the song in your head, aren't you? Alamarine, count to 4, Alamarine, then 3 more. And though that's quite enough of that, there is a reason that this episode is always on hated lists, even if it can never truly disappear from the franchise. It's incredibly silly, popping up very early in Star Trek Deep Space Nine's run. That means that the characters simply weren't well defined enough for the audience to enjoy them making fools of themselves. However, there really is so much to love here. There's brilliant moments between Quark and Odo, whose friendship would become such a backbone of the series as a whole. Avery Brooks, though he was quite vocal in how much he didn't love the episode, throws himself into it, while the other characters merely state the lyrics of the special song. Brooks uses those talented pipes to belt out a blinder. It might be a little more forgivable if it had appeared a little later on in the show's run, though even now, looking back on it with the lens of the time that's passed, it's a bit of harmless fun that never attempts to take itself too seriously. Now try and forget the tune again. I dare you. Number 2. These Other Voyages? Has there ever been an episode of Star Trek that has received quite as much hate as the final episode of Star Trek Enterprise? It's been reviled by cast and audiences alike, with its defenders generally keeping mostly quiet. In the years that followed its release, a rule of thumb became, if Scott Bakula was annoyed by something, it had to be really bad. Scott Bakula did not care for this episode. However, while this is an awful way for Enterprise to end, is the episode itself that bad? It features the return of Riker and Troy with a vocal cameo from Data. The Enterprise D is seen on screen for the first time since Star Trek Generations. The audience finally gets to meet the chef. Shran is back. The birth of the Federation is barely shown. There's plenty to enjoy. The two main problems with it are, first, that it isn't an episode of Enterprise so much as it's a forgotten episode of the Next Generation, and second, what is done to Trip. Now, this has very thankfully been undone in the Star Trek novels, so armed with that information, it makes the episode much easier to bear. It's really not that bad when viewed in isolation. Number 1. Fairhaven and Spirit Folk. Okay, here it is. Full disclosure, the accent gave it away. I'm an Irish man. Therefore, these episodes were bound to come up on some list sooner or later. The fact that they're both sharing the top spot is a tribute to how strongly the island of Ireland feels about them. The Spirit Folk Law was drafted after their release, which still bars Robert Duncan McNeill from entering the country. While that's of course nonsense, these episodes, Irish stereotypes and all, are actually fun. Though there's clearly many a parody of old country Irish on show, it's handled with good nature, which is starkly different from Up the Long Ladder, the Next Generation's second season episode featuring the diabolical Bring Lloydie. Whether it's Janeway's relationship with Michael the barman, or Harry's continued floundering with the girls in the village, there is a niceness, for want of a better word, on show. They're not the finest examples of writing that Star Trek Voyager's ever offered, but they're far from the worst as well. Once you get past Richard Reilly's attempt at an Irish accent, there is plenty to enjoy, and if there's one thing that Spirit Folk nails, it's the fact that the residents of the town accept the Voyager crew quickly, while still trying to find a way to turn it to their advantage as well. And in that respect, I feel like they captured me perfectly.
The Star Trek movies have always been a more hectic production than the Star Trek television show. And I don't just mean because there's bigger budgets involved, or, there could be any number of reasons, sometimes bigger sets. Sometimes they're just a cluster. With that in mind, I'm Sean Ferrick for TrekCulture, and here are 6 Star Trek films actors hated filming. Number 6, Star Trek nemesis, Marina Sirtis. Marina Sirtis has been with Star Trek since the very first episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, and after a couple of interesting first few seasons, where they really tried to figure out what Deanna Troi was as a character, by the latter half of The Next Generation, she really had settled into quite a dynamic character on the show. Now, when it came to the final film, she was just kind of tossed aside, as was Dr. Crusher, in fairness. This is because new director Stuart Baird came in and wasn't a fan of the series to begin with. Therefore, in Sirtis's opinion, he didn't really know what he was doing. You see, Baird had started his career as an editor, not a director. So this was a big enough budget for 2002 Hollywood film. At least, if you're going to get someone, maybe get someone who knew the source material. Jonathan Frakes was not invited back after the perceived failure that was Star Trek Insurrection. And also, no one asked his opinion while on set as well. Stuart Baird never spoke to him about ideas of what to do or what to do with the characters. It was a bit of a swing and a miss. Now, on top of all of this, Deanna Troi, who had spent years being developed finally as a dynamic, interesting and strong character, was effectively reduced to damsel in this film. Shinzon's assault on her, if it was me, I'd cut it from the film. It doesn't serve a narrative purpose other than to make Shinzon irredeemable. He's not just a flawed villain, he's evil. It was a mistake in the film, if I'm to be honest. So when Marina Sirtis came out and said that the director was a complete idiot, yeah, I think I see her point. Number 5, Star Trek Generations, Malcolm McDowell. Malcolm McDowell was already an established actor long before he became Dr. Tolian Sauron in the first of the Next Generation era movies. Now, he was undeniably brilliant in this film. He is one of the highlights of Generations, to be fair. Now, unfortunately, he wasn't an easy sell. He said in later years that it took the filmmakers 4 goes to convince him to do the film, and eventually he signed on for the money. He was refreshingly honest about that fact as well. Actors don't work for free. It's a craft, so yeah, okay, fair enough. He said as well that he was happy to have a chance to work with, as he called him, Old Baldy again, of course being Patrick Stewart, but then, as time went on, his nephew, a certain Alexander Siddig, confessed that his uncle had told him how much the script was in private. Also, added to that, some deranged fans start sending him death threats because he killed Captain Kirk, with William Shatner himself asking him while writing a novel, how did it feel to kill an American TV icon? Malcolm McDowell, I think, was quite generous in the way he described it after that, and I don't think we'll be seeing Sauron in any upcoming projects.
Now, as we mentioned, today's video is brought to you in partnership with Surfshock, who are our favourite VPN providers here at WhatCulture, because the last time we worked together, they let me do this. Howdy, partner. Want to watch new episodes of 90 Day Fiancé? By now, you've heard about the benefits of a virtual private network and how great they are in terms of allowing you to access your favorite shows and websites in other countries. But they're about so much more than that. Allow us to be serious for a moment. Did you know that some websites increase their prices based on your location and browsing history? Not with a VPN. Did you know when accessing public Wi-Fi, your confidential data can be accessed by malicious third parties? Not with a VPN. Did you know a lot of banks will immediately freeze your account if you attempt to access it from another country? An understandable precaution, but not with a VPN. Did you know that some countries are starting to ban things like Facebook and TikTok because they absolutely hate the idea of you having any fun? Not with a VPN, Donny. I'll floss all damn day long if I want to. Well, thanks to Surfshark, you can be the master of your own digital destiny across unlimited devices thanks to the incredible offer we have with them. Simply click the link in the description and enter promo code WhatCulture for 83% off and 3 extra months for free. 83% off. If I removed 83% of my clothing, we wouldn't be able to put the video out. That's how much that is. And on that mental image, back to the video.
Number 4, Star Trek Nemesis, again, and Tom Hardy. This is actually one of the sadder ones because Tom Hardy put his heart and soul into this role. Shinzon was more of an idea than a fully fleshed out character, which is not Tom Hardy's fault, but because of that, he didn't have an awful lot of material to work with. Now, he was working hard. He was doing between 14 and 18-hour days almost every day. He spoke about at the time he had given up all vices. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, none of these things. He just worked. So by the time the film wrapped, he was burned out. Then, when the film hit theaters, it bombed. People have called it the worst of the next-gen films. People have said all sorts of nasty things about it, really. But what it really did that was awful is that it sent Hardy into a tailspin. He relapsed heavily on alcohol. He ended up having to check himself into rehab in the following year, which is like, guys, he's an actor. At the end of the day, if you didn't like the film, fine. But come on. So, unfortunately, he did not take any of that time as a positive time in his career. Now, obviously, he has bounced back and he is doing fantastic in his career at the moment, which is great, especially because he was put right down to the bone by this. Although Nemesis is probably nobody's favorite Star Trek film, when you remember how much work went into it and how much strife came out of it, it's basically people owe Tom Hardy an apology. Number 3, Star Trek the Motion Picture, Persis Combata. When the project that had begun life as Phase 2 was dreamed up, Persis Combata was actually hired to play Lieutenant Ilia long before there was a movie. This was great for her. It was 5 years of guaranteed work. That's what was in the contract. She was a model, and so she obviously lived contract to contract. Great, 5 years, we don't have to worry about it. Then, quite suddenly, it was a motion picture. Now, that wasn't what she had signed up for originally. While she enjoyed the film and the filming experience itself, it was very much a swing and a miss in terms of her career, because that was it. That was 5 years earning just gone overnight. And the contract that she was then offered for the film obviously didn't take all of that to recompense her. Added to that, she shaved her head. Now there's varying basically stories about this, about her crying bitter tears over having to do this, or her being totally fine with doing this. Whatever the truth is there, either way, as a model, that would have affected her career at the time. She was not the biggest fan of the production from that point on, and it is unfortunate because while the motion picture, you know, we think it's a visual masterpiece at least, it doesn't have a lot of love in cinema, and she really gives it her all. Number 2, Star Trek the Motion Picture, William Shatner. Now, William Shatner is many things, but he is also blunt. And, hey, when it comes to a list like this, that's perfect. When he watched the premiere of Star Trek the Motion Picture, he thought to himself, well, that's it. We gave it our best shot. It wasn't any good. He thought they'd killed the franchise. That was it. Like, with Star Trek the Motion Picture, it was dead. Star Trek was done. They would be lucky to do the convention circuit through the 80s, maybe.
then of course it did so well at the box office. Now its budget set off that a little bit, but they were all surprised by how well the motion picture did, because as Shatner says, he didn't think it was any good. Having said that, it is easily their most beautiful film. Ask Bill Shatner what he thinks, he'll be honest with you. Number 1, Star Trek Insurrection, Marina Sirtis. And she's back again! Marina Sirtis, she's not as blunt as William Shatner, but she's not far off it, in fairness. When describing how she got on the set of Star Trek Nemesis, herself and LeVar Burton were talking about their experiences with the director, with everything, and she cut in with, well, at least it wasn't as bad as the previous movie we did. Now, I take issue with that a little bit, because first of all, Insurrection is nowhere near as bad as its reputation says it is. Also, Jonathan Frakes directed that, be nice. But it is also true that, again, Deanna Troi doesn't get much to do. Apart from that small storyline with Riker where they rekindle their relationship, which is a very welcome addition. They make for a perfect Star Trek couple. What else does Deanna Troi do in that film? Now you could argue that, hey, Marina, easy paycheck, enjoy it. But remember, this is, nearly 20 years of work has gone into making this character to kind of be told, hey, stand there, make a boob joke, and shoot that green screen over there, yeah? So, yeah, maybe not such a surprise.
Ah, good old Star Trek. Always friends with everyone, never falling out, never causing any issues, certainly never. Yeah. I'm Sean here for TrekCulture, and here are 8 Star Trek episodes that pissed off other franchises. Number 8, Our Man Bashir vs. MGM. Jumping in with one of the most famous ones, Our Man Bashir was the 4th season episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine that pays a loving tribute to the spy genre, though of course it most closely resembles the work of Ian Fleming. Alexander Siddig described the episode as The Spy Who Loved Me, From Russia With Love, Octopussy and DS9 all rolled into one. The episode aired 1 week after the release of GoldenEye, Pierce Brosnan's first movie as the famous spy. This was an attempt to capitalise on the resurgence of Bond. Thankfully for Star Trek, GoldenEye revived the franchise and was extremely well received. Unfortunately for Star Trek, MGM got wind of what had happened, and a very angry letter was sent to the producers. While the DS9 companion doesn't disclose what was actually in the letter, Ronald D. Moore simply said that MGM did not find imitation that flattering. This left the writers a little gun-shy about using overt Bond references in the future, so when the programme next appeared in Season 5's A Simple Investigation, the references were toned down significantly, avoiding another run-in with the rival studio. Number 7, Beyond the Farthest Star vs. Lost in Space. Look at those smug animated characters there. That's probably exactly what was going through Irvin Allen's mind in 1971. Allen created Lost in Space, Star Trek's perceived rival for sci-fi television in the 60s. Lost in Space was cancelled in 1968, 1 year before Star Trek finished with Turnabout Intruder in 1969. However, Lost in Space had continually beaten Star Trek in the war over ratings. Added to this, CBS originally bought Lost in Space, turning down Gene Roddenberry and Herb Solo's pitch for Star Trek. Funny about how these things come around in full circle, but back at this time, Lost in Space had succeeded where Star Trek had failed. However, the commission of Star Trek the Animated Series was a sign that Star Trek had a far greater staying power than Lost in Space did. This was supported by the growth in conventions and eventual green light for Star Trek the Motion Picture. Without doing anything overt to take down the rival show, Star Trek ended up getting the last laugh over Lost in Space in this period of history. At least Bill Mumy, the original Will Robinson, would go on to appear in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, although they did kill him, so who's to say if the bad blood has really ended? Number 6, Star Trek First Contact versus First Contact. Okay, yes, we know Star Trek First Contact is not an episode. However, Star Trek First Contact is the second Next Generation era film and is generally regarded as one of the best Trek movies to date. It featured the return of the Borg, the depiction of the first meeting between humans and the Vulcans, and, best of all, the Enterprise E makes its glorious debut. It was seen as a marked improvement on Star Trek Generations, which had suffered a bit at the box office and with its critical reception. However, after the release of the film, Paramount Pictures were slapped with a lawsuit from the estate estate of Murray Leinster, the lawsuit alleged that Star Trek First Contact violated trademark protections on Leinster's 1945 novella First Contact. This novella ironically won a retrospective Hugo Award in 1996 and is generally accepted as the origin of the term universal translator. The Eastern District of Virginia found that the phrase First Contact as applied to alien encounters may very well have originated with Leinster in 1945. However, since that time, this term had moved on to common use as a way to describe the initial meeting between mankind and extraterrestrial beings. The court ruled in favour of Paramount Pictures. Number 5. Dawn versus Enemy Mine. Dawn is a second season episode of Enterprise that is generally regarded as one of the weakest offerings of the seasons, perhaps of the entire show overall. Trip is attacked by an alien vessel, though both then crash land on an inhospitable world. Together, they must find a way to cooperate or risk dying of exposure and dehydration before rescue. There is one problem immediately. The episode is a remake of Darmok, which is often regarded as one of the best episodes of Star Trek in its entirety. However, fans of Barry B. Longyear were quick to point out that the episode wasn't simply a remake of that episode, it owed a lot to the 1985 film Enemy Mine, starring Dennis Quaid and Louis Gossett Jr. The film was based on Longyear's 1980 novella of the same name. Though Enemy Mine dealt with a much longer time period, the episode's plot followed more or less the early parts of the script, stopping short of having Trip and Zokan spend 3 years living with each other on the planet. This episode earned harsh reviews from critics, with its writer John Scheiben being labelled a plagiarist as well. Number 4. Profit and Loss versus Warner Brothers. Profit and Loss is a second season episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine that takes Quark firmly and puts him in the front seat, for once depicting him as the romantic lead of the episode. His old flame, Professor Natima Lang, arrives on the station with her students, Hogue and Raquelin. They are fleeing from the Cardassian government, though Quark gets caught up in a plot involving revolutionaries, spies and warring governments. Quark is Rick Blaine, Lang is Ilsa Lund, and the plot is entirely based on the film Casablanca, which is arguably the most romantic film ever made. Take a hike, The Notebook. The plots are so close to each other, in fact, that the original title of the episode was going to be Here's Looking at You. Warner Brothers were having none of it, and the episode was quickly retitled on the threat of legal action. Actual Story was vague enough without the direct reference to get away with being made. Having the title be an actual line from the film? Absolutely not. The episode's ending is pretty much a direct lift from the film, with even Garak getting into the fun, playing the part of Captain Louis Renault. It's a fun, romantic example of gently lifting a plot and dropping it into the 24th century. Number 3. Distant Origin versus Jurassic Park. Distant Origin is a third season episode of Star Trek Voyager that is generally regarded as one of the strongest overall scripts in the show's 7-season run. The plot follows Professor Gagan, a Galileo-esque academic who is on a quest to prove that his species, the Voth, are descended from mammals on a far-off world. That world happens to be Earth, and while it isn't mammals they are descended from, it is in fact the dinosaurs, specifically the Parasaurolophus. The episode aired on the 30th of April 1997, 4 years after the release of Jurassic Park, and roughly 1 month before the release of the Lost World Jurassic Park. This episode directly contradicts both films, as Janeway and the Doctor categorically state that the Hadrosaurs were cold-blooded creatures. The Jurassic Park franchise maintained that they were warm-blooded, which was in keeping with scientific trends that had originated in the 70s with the discovery of the Deinonychus. Though there is little evidence that the Jurassic Park franchise was in any way adversely affected by the episode, it was an example of Star Trek seemingly going out of its way to be different from one of the most successful franchises, or at the time, movies, of all time. Number 2. Elementary Dear Data versus Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's estate. Elementary Dear Data was the second season episode of Star Trek The Next Generation that landed the show in a bit of bother. In it, Data plays Holmes, Geordi plays Watson, and the villainous Professor Moriarty makes his first appearance. However, when the writers were working on the episode, they mistakenly thought that the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had passed into the public domain, when this actually wasn't the case. When the episode aired, the estate of Doyle got in touch with Paramount Pictures. They informed the company that the estate still held a percentage of the rights to the characters, therefore they would require a fee if the episode was ever to receive a sequel. The legal issues surrounding this took a further 3 years to rectify. By the time they were fully sorted, the production was underway on the show's 6th season. The episode Ship in a Bottle was drafted, featuring the return of Professor Moriarty, who had been kept in a static state for the previous few years. There was an explanation given on screen as to the unusual delay, though really, it all came down to the courts. Number 1. Emissary versus Babylon 5. J. Michael Straczynski began working on his idea for Babylon 5 in 1986. He pitched the idea to Paramount Pictures, who declined. Warner Brothers would later give him the green light and production began on the pilot episode, The Gathering, in 1992. While the show was filmed quickly, the post-production process took longer than their Star Trek counterparts, which resulted in The Gathering airing 7 weeks later than Emissary. While Straczynski has always remained diplomatic in the way he spoke about the two shows, he felt that Paramount Pictures was certainly guided by his brief for Babylon 5 when it came to Deep Space Nine. He asserts that Rick Berman and Michael Piller weren't at fault, as he believes they couldn't have known about his script for the show. However, there were some similarities particularly singled out. A space station near a transit hub, head of the station is a commander, not a captain, female second in command, a central marketplace including a casino, the station contains diplomats, merchants and the like, both feature characters who could change their shape. While he stopped short of taking any sort of legal action against Paramount, the two shows were definite rivals on the television circuit in the 90s, with fans to this day split as to which one was the better show.